So this is William Z. Foster, and he was the man who more or less became, he was the key leader of the Communist Party of the United States during its better years. And the reason we're talking about the Communist Party is because the Communist Party was the first anti-imperialist organization in the United States. And we're saying anti-imperialist in the Leninist sense. Imperialism is not a policy, it's a system. And at the Bolshevik Revolution that happened in Russia, Lenin came out with his understanding that capitalism had entered this new stage called imperialism. Marx talked about the workers versus the capitalists, right? You have the working class, the people who sell their labor power, and then you have those who own the factories or own the major companies. Those are the capitalists. And Marx said that there are no nations. We want to break down national barriers. Workers of the world unite. And Marx thought that history was moving forward, like a train. First you have hunter-gatherer civilization. Then out of hunter-gatherer civilization, you get slavery, and out of slavery, you get feudalism, and then feudalism gives birth to capitalism, and capitalism creates a system where you have, two classes, those who own the factories and own the means of production and those who work in them, and eventually the workers will rise up and seize the means of production, and that's socialism, and then socialism leads to the ultimate stage of a world with so much wealth and abundance that you have communism. Right? That was Marx's theory. And Marx thought that the Western countries were the most advanced because they had become capitalist first. And so he assumed that socialism would come in the Western countries first, and that it would be a fight between the workers and the bosses in the Western countries. He thought Germany was the most advanced country in Europe and that Germany was where the revolution would happen. And Marxism became very popular as Marx was dying. It was quite small in Marx's time. There were different socialist groups that existed. But as Marx was dying, you started to see Marxism and socialism really starting to expand throughout the world. And after Marx's death, you had Marxist and socialist groups growing all across Western Europe. And you had the Second International, which was the Socialist International. And you had the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And you had the Socialist Party of France, and you had the Labour Party of Britain, and you had all kinds of groups that were being formed that advocated socialism. And you had labor unions. Workers would be in factories, and they would organize unions and go on strike and demand higher conditions. And the labor movement was growing, and the socialist parties were getting elected, but you weren't seeing a revolution. And in fact, the economy of Western Europe was starting to stabilize. Marx had predicted that things would get worse and worse. The gap between the rich and poor would get more and more and more, and then the workers would have more unemployment, and their living standards would go down, and they would eventually rise up and seize control of their factories and seize control of the government. And it wasn't happening. And actually, as the labor movement was growing, and as these socialist groups were becoming more popular and winning more seats in the parliament, things in Europe were actually starting to stabilize. And in Europe, you saw living standards start to go up. And a lot of the reforms that socialists fought for, like in Germany, they created, kindergartens were created. And that was won by socialists who went out and organized, demanded the right that kindergartens be created so that children could have education. That stabilized society. I think Germany created the first national health care service. And that was a demand that socialists fought for. And it stabilized society. And so you had what was called the crisis of Marxism, because Marxism and socialism were everywhere in Europe, but there wasn't a revolution, and things were going kind of in the opposite direction that the socialist and Marxist movement thought they were going. And so there were different opinions about why that might be. And you had Bernstein, and Bernstein was the leader of Marxism in Austria, I believe, and he said, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. And that he said, well, basically what's happening is that capitalism is just kind of naturally turning into socialism, right? Because we have an 8-hour workday, and we have labor unions, and everyone can vote, and so capitalism is just kind of naturally turning into socialism. And then you had other forces that said, well, the reason the revolution isn't happening is perhaps maybe there's like a spiritual problem, like we're not tapping into people's desire for revolution, and we're watering things down too much. There were a lot of different interpretations of why it was happening. Well, Lenin came along, and Lenin said what's happening is that capitalism in the Western countries is stabilizing because they're exploiting the third world, and that capitalism is moving into its monopolistic stage of imperialism. And that's dividing the working class at home. And the division in the working class at home is between the skilled workers and the unskilled workers. And this is important in what we're going to talk about when we start talking about the CPUSA. So in America, we've had the main labor federation that existed at the time was called the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. And the AFL, back in these days, was for only skilled workers, meaning you had to go through an apprenticeship to be in it. And in order to get an apprenticeship, the union had to like take you in to be an apprentice. And often they would only give that to people that were white. They would only give it to people who spoke English. They would only give it to people who were U.S. born. And the AFL, they were skilled workers. And people that didn't have a skill, that were what they called industrial workers, that worked on the assembly line, they were not organized into the AFL. The AFL wouldn't take them. And the American Federation of Labor, the workers in the AFL that were in the so-called skilled jobs, they got higher wages. And they became more and more conservative as they got their higher wages. And they tended to be more and more supportive of wars around the world. And they tended to oppose the strikes and protests of lower paid workers. And this was the division of the working class that was being created by imperialism. Because the capitalists of the United States and Britain and France were able to exploit the whole world, they could buy off the skilled workers at home. And the skilled workers, they were what you called the aristocracy of labor, meaning that they were technically workers, but because they were getting some of the crumbs, they were getting privileges, their revolutionary potential was being watered down, and they were becoming more reformist and less revolutionary. And the Socialist Party of America was dominated by AFL unions. And the Socialist Party of Germany, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, was dominated by skilled workers. And the Labor Party was dominated by skilled workers. And as the AFL, or as the skilled workers came to dominate what was considered socialism, what was the labor movement, it became less and less revolutionary. And then the climax of the crisis of Marxism was World War I. World War I broke out, and all the socialist groups that were part of the Marxist Socialist International, they'd all promised they would never send workers to go die killing other workers in a capitalist war. And they all sold out and changed their position. And the German Socialist Party, the Social Democratic Party, they supported World War I, and the Labor Party in Britain supported World War I, and all the socialist groups that had promised they would never support a war supported World War I, and that was considered to be the moment when what you might call socialism or Marxism in Europe was discredited, because at that point socialism had failed to deliver. It had promised it was going to make a revolution. It didn't make a revolution. And then in the moment when a disastrous war broke out, they refused to stop it. And socialism in Western Europe had kind of proved itself to not have revolutionary energy. But Lenin was in Russia, and Lenin was saying that because of this division in the working class, the stratification, the revolutionary energy would not be in the West, it would be in the East. It would be in the colonized countries. And that nationalism among colonized people was actually a good thing, because they were fighting to be free from imperialism. So a nation in the imperialist world, in the colonized world, you could have a whole nation fighting for its freedom, and that could be a good thing. But the working class would lead the nation to fight for its liberation. So instead of saying, workers of the world unite, we don't want any nations, the understanding was a nationalism can be a good thing, right? That was Leninism. And Leninism targets imperialism and says opposing imperialism is the focus. And at the same time, Leninism also calls for breaking with the reformist leaders and going lower and deeper to the real masses and organizing the lower levels of workers and to be against imperialism. And the goal in Leninism, or of the Western countries, is the idea that the working people in the imperialist countries have the same destiny and the same interests as the countries around the world that are struggling against imperialism. And that it is the working class in the Western countries, they need to align with the people in the colonized world to fight for their national liberation. And that is the Marxist-Leninist interpretation. That's different than what Karl Marx said, because Marx was just talking about workers and bosses. Lenin talks about imperialism. He talks about the division in the working class. He talks about the struggle of countries around the world to break out of imperialism. The Communist Party of the United States was the first anti-imperialist organization in the Leninist sense, and that it was the first organization with this understanding. And this guy, William Z. Foster, he's the individual for which the Communist Party took leadership from and became inspired by. So we're just going to talk about his life story. William Z. Foster was an Irish American. He was born in Taunton, Massachusetts, which is near Boston, but he spent most of his childhood in Philadelphia. His father was an Irish freedom fighter who had fled from Ireland to the United States. And he was a working class person. He was from a very large family. He went to work at a very young age. He had many odd jobs throughout his life. He was a sailor. He was a lumberjack. He had many different jobs. And the labor movement of workers, kind of struggling against their employers was part of his everyday life. And that he was not part of the AFL. He was an unskilled worker. And during these times, there were a lot of traveling workers, low-income people that would go from town to town taking on different jobs. And that was William Z. Foster. There was a whole layer of people who immigrated to the United States from Eastern Europe or from Italy or from Ireland, and they were going different places and working odd jobs. They were paid very low wages. So the story is that William Z. Foster, one day he was heading to work, and he came across a guy who was standing on a soapbox. And the guy on the soapbox was preaching socialism. And so William Z. Foster listened to the guy on the soapbox, and he listened to what he had to say, and he argued with him a little bit, and he became convinced that socialism was the answer. And so he then joined the Socialist Party of the United States, and he joined the Industrial Workers of the World. So the AFL was the skilled workers union. That was for, you had to be white, you had to take on an apprenticeship, you had to be born in the United States. But there was another union that was formed called the IWW. And that was the Industrial Workers of the World. And it was a union that any worker could join. You didn't have to be born in the United States. You didn't have to be a U.S. citizen. You didn't have to speak English. It was a union for all workers, and it was a more radical union, the IWW, and it was led by revolutionaries. Their goal was to eventually overthrow capitalism, and the IWW was the radical alternative to the AFL. And the IWW was famous for the fact that they would refuse to sign contracts with their employers because they said that was recognizing the boss's right to exploit you. And they would do what they called a strike on the job, meaning that they'd be working in a factory, or they'd be working in a mine, or they'd be lumberjacks in an encampment, cutting down trees, and they would sabotage the materials that they worked with. And they would send messages to the boss, if things don't improve, we're going to keep breaking your tools and breaking your materials. They called this the strike on the job. And the IWW was famous for their free speech fights, because in the western United States, in Washington and in Oregon and in California, a lot of states outlawed preaching socialism on street corners. And so the Wobblies, they would go to a town and they would start preaching revolutionary messages, and they'd be arrested for violating a city ordinance that was against it. So then all the Wobblies from all over the country would go to that town and one by one get arrested until the town's jails had been completely full, and to the point that the town would then kind of give in and change its rules. And all over the United States, they had free speech fights where local towns would try to outlaw socialist preaching or socialist teaching, and they would go and get arrested, and thousands of Wobblies would get arrested until the town gave in and allowed them to speak. And the Wobblies were also known for their songs that kind of taught like Marxist principles. They would take popular songs from the time period, and they would rewrite the words to them to be socialist and revolutionary songs. And there's one song that was called A Long Way to Tipperary. I don't know if you ever heard it. It's like an old song. So the Wobblies rewrote it to be A Long Way Down to the Soup Line. And we actually have it reprinted. The lyrics are here, and Tyler's going to come play it, and we're going to do A Long Way Down to the Soup Line. So there we go. So it's on page 9. Page 9. Brown was just a working man like others of his kind. Lost his job and tramped the streets when work was hard to find. The landlord put him on the street, the bankers kept his dough. And this is what poor Joe would sing wherever he would go. It's a long way down to the soup line. It's a long way to go. It's a long way down to the soup line. And the soup is thin, I know. Goodbye to dear old pork chops. Farewell to beefsteak rare. It's a long, long way down to the soup line, but my soup is there. So Bill and 16 16 million more responded to the call to force the hours of labor down and thus make jobs for all. They picketed the industries and won the 4-hour day and organized a general strike so folks don't have to say it's a long way down to the soup line. It's a long, long way to go. It's a long way down to the soup line, and the soup is thin, I know. Goodbye to good old pork chops, farewell to beefsteak rare. It's a long, long way down to the soup line, but my soup is there. The workers run the factories now where jobs everyone's employed, where big machines once filled the world with hungry unemployed. We all own homes, we're living well, we're happy, free and strong, and millionaires wear overalls and sing this little song. It's a long way down to the soup line. It's a long, long way to go. It's a long way down to the soup line, and the soup is thin, I know. Goodbye to good old pork chops, farewell to beefsteak rare. It's a long, long way down to the soup line, but my soup is there.
Let's do it one more time. It's
A long, long way down to the soup line, but my soup is there.
Woo! Thank y'all.
Thank you. So that last verse, the workers own the factories now where jobs were once destroyed by big machines that fill the world with hungry unemployed. What's that about? That's about labor being replaced by machines and people losing their jobs as production becomes more efficient. And that's a really, really important part of the Marxist economic theory. So we're going to take just a moment, a break from talking about William Z. Foster, and we're going to talk about that because this is very important. And if you want to understand why we're having an economic crisis in our time, it's because of this. And it's because of what Marx very much showed. So if you own a factory and you're making a product, you're going to need materials to make your product with. You're going to need materials with which to make your product. So that's A, all right? Say you're making some tires. We're making tires. So the rubber, the materials to make the tires, that's going to be A. And then you're going to need to ship your product. You're going to need to ship it to the place that it's being sold. So that's going to be B. And then you're going to need workers who will assemble your tires, human labor. So that's going to be C. And then the final cost of the product when people go and buy the tire is going to be D, right? So the materials, the shipping, and then the human labor power all add up to the final cost. What's missing? Profit. The capitalist has to make a profit. But the capitalist can't change how much the materials cost, and the capitalist can't change how much the shipping costs. And so in order to make his profit, the capitalist has to cut in to the labor of the worker, right? And so really, the labor power, the labor value put into the product includes C1, which is what the worker actually gets paid, and C2, which is what the capitalist extracts for himself in profit. And that's when people talk about exploitation, that's what they're talking about, because the worker isn't paid the full value of what they produce. The idea is that the capitalist is stealing some of the value the worker puts into it as his own profit. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is this, right? C1 is what the worker actually gets paid. C1 is always going to be less than D. The amount of wages paid out in the process of production are never enough to buy back the product that is produced. The capitalist, as he produces products, is always putting less money power into the working class than there is to buy the product that he's producing. We can never buy back what we produce. The worker can never buy back what he produces. And this is a constant problem in the capitalist economy. It's called overproduction. And this is acknowledged by almost all economists. John Maynard Keynes calls it underconsumption. And he writes about how you need the government to spend money. And, the U.S. government does all kinds of things to deal with this crisis. For example, in Missouri, in Springfield, Missouri, there's a cave with billions of dollars worth of cheese buried in it. Why? Because the American government buys that cheese from farmers and buries it in a cave in order to keep the price of dairy high enough to solve a crisis of overproduction. The military-industrial complex is to deal with this problem. The government spends millions of dollars buying tanks and guns and drones and weapons, and that keeps the economy going. And this problem of glut, of poverty created by abundance, that you have so many products and you have workers who can't afford to buy them and companies break down, this is a constant problem in the capitalist economy. And technology makes the problem worse because of the fact that the capitalist is trying to save money. He's trying to save money, and so he wants to reduce labor costs. And so he's replacing human labor with machines. Machines replace human labor. The idea is if you can have a machine do it rather than a person, you can save money, save paying wages. However, there's a problem, which is that as C decreases, as the percentage of the price, the percentage of D that comes from C, from human labor power, decreases, as C decreases, C2 also decreases. As the involvement of human labor in production goes down, the profit that the capitalist makes also goes down, because the capitalist can only extract profit from human labor, right? He can't extract profit from the fixed capital, from the shipping. He can't extract profit from the materials. He can only extract profit from human labor. So as the amount of human labor involved in making a product goes down, the rate of profit that the capitalist makes also goes down. So in order to make up for the fact that he's making a less and less of a rate of profit on each product, the capitalist has to churn out even more products to make more money. And this leads to an economic crisis. And whenever you have a huge leap in technology in capitalism, it's followed by a huge economic crisis, because the result is that the amount of labor power that's necessary to put into a product decreases. So number one, a lot of workers lose their job. And number two, the amount of profit that the capitalist can make on each product decreases. So the capitalist pretty soon is filling the market up with products that can't be sold. And this is the problem that is inherent in the capitalist mode of production. For example, I tell people self-driving cars would be a great thing in a rational society, because this job called driving would no longer be necessary. And all the people who are spending their labor power as truck drivers or Uber drivers or running traffic courts, they wouldn't have to do it any longer because the cars would drive themselves. But in our economy, self-driving cars would lead to an economic crisis. Andrew Yang talked about how self-driving cars would lead to riots in the streets and mass unrest in the United States. Like millions of people would be out of work and hungry, and there would be a crisis. What sense does that make? Why should people be poorer because it's more efficient to produce products? Why should the creation of more wealth lead to greater poverty? Why should we have poverty created by abundance? That is something that Marx pointed out. In all systems of the past, when people were homeless, they were homeless because there wasn't enough housing. In all systems of the past, when people were hungry, they were hungry because there wasn't enough food. But capitalism is the first system in history where people can be homeless because there's too much housing, where people can be hungry because there is too much food. And in fact, the more efficient that they make production, the poorer people get. And this is completely irrational. And what's going on in our time is that with artificial intelligence and with the computer revolution, they've created a situation where C has never been lower than it is now. Machines can do almost anything, right? Machines can play chess better than humans can. Machines can trade stocks better than humans can. Machines can do almost anything. And that should be a great thing, because there'd be less work for everybody, and we should all live in a society of abundance because we've advanced technologically. But because we have an irrational system controlled by profits, it's leading to a huge economic crisis, because there's billions and billions of people who have no way to survive because they can't sell their labor power. And on top of that, the capitalists are producing more and more products than they ever have because they need fewer workers than ever before. But because there's few of us being hired, we can't buy them back. And that is the crisis that we're in. And that you have to understand Marxism to understand the long-term economic crisis. And this is what is driving the capitalists to have an all-out war against China. And this is what is driving the capitalists to fight among themselves to try and stabilize the economy, is we have this built-in problem that poverty is created by abundance in this system. So this is kind of foundational material, understanding that we live in imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, understanding that capitalism has this problem of overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profit. So I think since this is kind of the foundational material, I think we should take our first break and discuss this in small groups. Yeah.
The Labour Party that you were talking about that goes worldwide, is that the same as the Labour Party in Britain?
Yes. So when Marx was alive, he formed something called the First International, and it fell apart because it was run by anarchists and they fought with Marx and all of that. So then as Marx was dying, something called the Second International came into existence. And the Second International was the Labour Party of Britain. It was the French Socialist Party, the German Social Democratic Party. A lot of the groups that are still around today that are socialist or reformist socialist parties come out of that, and they all supported World War I. And then Lenin in Moscow, after the Russian Revolution, they considered all these parties to have sold out, they formed the Third International, or the Communist International. And so, yes, the Labour Party in Britain is part of the Socialist International or the Second International. I think Democratic Socialists of America has some kind of relationship with DSA as part of this Second International. Yeah, social democracy is the Second International, and that's what the Labour Party is. It's social democracy. So, yeah. So let's do 5 minutes, and then we'll reconvene and have like a group discussion together, and then we'll move on to the next section of the class. So 5 minutes, folks.
That always develops, that exists even to this day. So AI is going to be the new big thing that we're going to be addressing and facing.
The important thing about A
Okay,
and B is that you can't cut into them to extract profit. That's the point. You might be able to reduce the cost, right? But you can't cut into it to extract surplus value. Right? That's
Well,
the point.
but theoretically, if like digital, that would be A, completely saves money, then it could save money for all. But it's more a psychopathology that C won't profit as much. They just have it fixed in their minds that even if A goes way down and you could give more profit to C1, C2 just won't do it. And it's more a psychopathology than it is actual economic reality.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, just to your point, that, I mean, basically the A and B are the fixed, like I'm sorry, not fixed, but they're just uncontrollable variables. And, you know, I mean, if the shipping for anything, you know, even, let's say the internet goes down, you know, because making those networks, making all that does cost money as well. That's a cost, that's,
Not
you know,
much.
a lot of work into it. Yeah, once it's set up, but, you know, in a situation, the internet infrastructure still has to be built. But if the shipping and the materials end up just having to be so much money, I mean, that's a crisis in and of itself, and C is going to be affected. You know, well, they're going to probably try to jack up the money they take, and, you know, jack up the price and all that. But it's not, you know, basically A and B are just uncontrollable. You know, ultimately, you know.
I disagree.
That's fair.
Anyone else? Any other comments? Nate and then Phil. Yeah.
Okay.
We talked about like how AI is like, I mean, he talks about self-driving cars, but AI is kind of the final nail in the coffin since we don't live in socialism. Because self-driving cars, that would take away a bunch of jobs, but once AI like transcends human intelligence and we're getting there, I feel like that's going to take a lot more jobs away.
Oh, we'll do.
Phil,
I'm sorry. Okay, Phil first.
No. Okay. Thank you. To Kat's point that she made, you know, I remember back when the CCP had that the state owned all businesses within China, but then they made somewhat of a move to join the global economy and allowed citizens of the CCP to own their businesses, but they had a cap on how much profit they can make, and then the rest would go to the government, and that's where, living in a socialist economy works, is that, a person can make a profit and own their own business, but the government puts controls on that profit margin that the owner of the business has, so that way, A and B doesn't necessarily contribute to C.
Well, I think it's more that the industries, whether they're private or state-run, in a classic socialist economy, like the Soviet Union during the Stalin years, almost everything was state-run. Nowadays, socialist countries tend to have a mixed economy, but the idea is that profit doesn't define production. They have a 5-year economic plan where the state says, all right, we need this, we need growth in this sector, we need this to happen, and the irrationality of the market is not in command. So you don't have this built-in problem. And instead, you can just have the state kind of planning out, okay, we need growth here, we need infrastructure here, and they kind of plan out the economy to keep growing and not deal with this problem of labor. And you'll notice that China doesn't have this problem, I mean, the economic meltdown that happened in 2015, for example, the global economy crashed. A lot of the foreign investment that was coming into China wasn't coming in. So the Chinese government just stepped in and filled the void, and their economy just kept going. And that there's, that socialism is, a lot of people think socialism is a welfare state. It's when the government gives people free stuff. Well, that happens in every society to some degree or other, right? I mean, these roads out here are paid for by tax dollars, and you need that to facilitate the market, right? The government taxing people and providing services happens in every society to some degree or other, capitalist, socialist, feudal, whatever. And some people think socialism is just a worker cooperative enterprise because the workers are co-owners. Well, that worker cooperative, if it still operates according to profit, you're still gonna have all these problems. Socialism is when the economy is no longer functioning according to the profits of private owners, but when society as a whole controls the economy in order to continue to oversee and make sure you have long-term economic growth. Socialism is the elimination of the chaos of the market or the anarchy of production, right? And in order to make sure you have growth. And socialism is the first stage when you have gotten rid of this problem of capitalism. So the artificial restraints on human growth are no longer imposed and society can keep growing. And communism is the ultimate stage of a world with so much wealth and abundance that the need for a state fades away, that inequality fades away because everyone has enough and people can just kind of take what they need. And communism is the ultimate goal of growth unlimited to the point that human beings live a much more prosperous and free existence. So.
Well, my point being was the gentleman that owns Alibaba, which is it's a Chinese company. The guy now is a multi-billionaire. His Alibaba is the biggest manufacturer in China, but still the government limits, or caps what the gentleman who owns Alibaba can make in profit, which, like I said, avoids A and B turning into C.
All right, so anyone else want to make a comment?
Can I make one real quick?
Go ahead, please.
Feedback on that. Here, I'll just use this.
Your mic, okay.
Go ahead.
I find the Alibaba thing, because that was a big revelation for me to understand that you can get incredibly rich in China as well. It's just they're not going to let Jack Ma take over the government. You can make as much money as you want, but you're not going to run this thing, which is the opposite in our country.
No, I tell people that in America, the corporations control the government, and in socialist countries, the government controls the corporation.
Well, even with Alibaba in China, the CCP limits the amount of profit that. I'm sorry.
You're good.
With Alibaba, the CCP limits the amount of profit that the gentleman can make. I can't remember the guy's name.
Well, it's more, though, that they tell them what they can and cannot do.
Oh,
right?
okay.
You don't simply run the company based on whatever is profitable. You don't have the chaos of the market.
Right.
That's more the issue, right? Yes, they do limit the amount of profit they can make in some cases. They tax them, etc. But the point is that the economic activity that both private and state-run industries carry out is according to an overall central plan. It's the abolition of the chaos of the market. So now we have a performer.
Irving,
Irving, you want to say that? Okay,
Oh.
please, yeah.
I mean, there's a lot to talk about. I wanted you to address the issue of what Marx thought productivity can actually create more leisure time, and I want you to make a comment on that, because the idea is that if the workers own the productive forces, instead of working 10 hours, they can work 6 hours or 4 hours and have more leisure time for one's own enjoyment. Did you want to make a comment on that?
Well, yeah, and that's actually in the song as well, right? You know, that song, it says, they picketed the industries and won a 4-hour day. Human labor is way more productive. The 8-hour day we got in the 1930s with the Fair Labor Standards Act. Human labor now is far more productive because of technology. The amount of, when you work 8 hours today, you're producing way more value because of technology than you were producing back in the 1930s. But yet we still have an 8-hour day, and that doesn't make any sense because our human labor creates so much more value, right? And that it's human labor creates value. Technology increases the amount of value that human labor is creating. So why not demand that as we produce more value with our labor, the amount of labor we have to do decrease, right? I mean, that's kind of the idea, right? But our labor is more productive, so why don't?
40-hour
Yeah.
work week is the norm. It's the acceptable norm between capital and labor.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also discussion of 4-day work week, 10-hour days. It's the other modification of the 8-hour 5 days.
Right, and then the idea of communism, the higher stage of communism, is that there would be a no-hour work week. That communism is a society with so much abundance that people's work is only voluntary. People work to stop being bored. He talks about labor becomes life's prime want and no longer a necessity, right? Like that's the goal, is a post-scarcity world with so much wealth that the need for that inequality fades away, the need for the state fades away. And that capitalism, because we have production organized for profit, it is holding back what is possible with human technology. I think that's a huge, essential part of Marxism that is missing from a lot of the Marxism that we see out there. People talk about workers and employers and it's not fair. People talk about how millionaires don't pay taxes and all that. But this is really the essence of what Karl Marx was talking about how technological advancement leads to poverty, and that's not rational. And if we overcame that contradiction, we could have a society of so much wealth and abundance that we could get beyond all of this. So, any other comments people want to make? Did you want something? Yeah, go ahead, Will.
I think AI, right, as a sentient thing, may be a little bit mythical. Like, I don't necessarily believe in the singularity, because as a Marxist, I believe that even AI is congealed labor. It's like a lot of technicians have put a lot of effort into the algorithms. And I worry about people like thinking magically about the production of commodities by commodities. I mean, that may happen 1 or 2 degrees, but it's like that 6 degrees of separation. I don't think we're ever going to escape that and have sentience. And I worry about that impacting the left, because like, I think it's like sort of disarming for a lot of people. Like the future, it's all going to work out, but we still have a lot of labor to do.
Yeah. All right. Anyone else want to make a comment? If not, I guess we're going to have a hammered dulcimer performance before we go on to our next class. So this is Sam.
Yes, so just to introduce Sam Muffet. Sam. Oh, here. After you're done. Okay. Sam Muffet is not only my neighbor; she's family. She's a very accomplished musician. She plays the hammered dulcimer as well as a few other instruments. She plays in various groups and focuses a lot on folk music and sort of traditional music, especially from this region and up in Quebec, where she does many performances and is very well known for her musical talent. And so we'd love to hear some amazing performance. Of course, this is the hammered dulcimer, also known as the santur in Iran, in India, and other places. It's a worldwide instrument, of course. And Sam's going to play a couple songs from around the world for us today. Thank you so much, Sam.
I'm just going to show them. Yeah. So this has 78 strings. Just thought I'd show you that because I'm looking at it, but you can't see it. And I hit it with these little sticks called hammers. And it comes originally from the Near East, from Iraq and Iran. It's still played there, of course. But it got westernized in the sense that they changed the scale and use it in a slightly different way in Western Europe, and then got brought here by German immigrants in the 1800s, I think. So anyway, I have one. I've always been drawn to unusual instruments. And the nice thing about them is there aren't a million people playing them, so you can't compare me to the person in the garage or the person on YouTube. And yeah, I like world music. Yeah, I don't know if they'll, well, okay, we'll see. I hope it doesn't distort it. Because it's really nice acoustically. That's so you can hear my voice, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's on the low settings.
Yeah, I go to Quebec a lot because I got involved with music up there, and I'm a francophone, so I go to France, but I can't afford to fly there anymore, so I just go to Quebec. But yeah, I'm in a couple of bands, and I play solo down here. I've been playing for years and years. And I also play other things because if you play hammered dulcimer all the time, it kind of drives you crazy. It's hard to, you got to tune it a lot. You got to carry it around. Some people, you walk in the room and they go, oh no, not a hammered dulcimer. Some musicians don't like it because there's been some people that have played it out of tune. Let's just say that. It's got a bad reputation sometimes. But in any case, I just came back from Quebec where I was really honored. I was in a pub playing for a Quebec session, you know, just a jam session. And almost everyone there had never seen it, and they were practically worshiping me. It was like, they were like, you have to come see this instrument. You won't believe it. And they were all coming around and looking at it. So it was very sweet to have that kind of naive enthusiasm toward this rather than immediately going, oh no, too weird. All right, so anyway, yeah, I'm just gonna, it's not really a concert, but I'm gonna share with you a couple of pieces this morning, just now from, first one's from Sweden. It's called a slang polska. I also do folk dancing. So this is a wonderful dance people do in a circle with couples going around in a circle, kind of walking, but then doing fancy things with their arms and their partner. And then I will go into a more of a jig rhythm and play something from Quebec called La Maison de Glace, okay? So I'm going to start with, I can't even pronounce the name, but it's a Swedish piece. So my idea was just to, just to play on and off today, like street music. You can kind of come up around me if you want and look, because it's fun to watch what I'm doing. And not really make this like a performance, but now you've had a little demo, so I'll leave you to it, right? You're going to go back to...
Next section, we'll have you play
Yes,
another one. So
exactly.
Thank you, Sam.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so now that we've kind of laid the foundations, we'll talk about what happened next. So William Z. Foster was an industrial worker. He was involved in the Wobblies and the IWW. But he realized that the IWW, the more radical labor union that was for all workers, they had a bit of a problem in that they wouldn't sign contracts with employers, and that most working class people were in the AFL. Most people that were in unions were in the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor was pretty mainstream. The leaders tended to be socialists, in the Socialist Party, but they tended to vote for the unions would endorse Democrats or Republicans in elections. They were pretty mainstream. And the IWW was a very radical union that they formed their own union, but they were kind of isolated, and they wouldn't sign contracts with employers, and they also, had a very radical message. They wanted to overthrow capitalism. They wanted a revolution. And William Z. Foster realized that the IWW, because it was so radical and because it wouldn't work with the AFL, and because they wouldn't sign contracts, they were pretty isolated. So William Z. Foster came up with his own theory called boring from within. And he said he wanted to join the American Federation of Labor and infiltrate it and push it in a more revolutionary direction. That was what he developed. And instead of, the idea of having a separate radical revolutionary union, that's called dual unionism. And he said we want to not have a dual unionist approach. We want to build what he called a militant minority inside the American Federation of Labor. And he called it boring from within, like boring, if you dig. So boring from within. So he and the IWW tried to convince the IWW to go into the AFL and recruit people. And there was a disagreement. And William Z. Foster and his followers, they ended up quitting the IWW. And they formed what was called the Syndicalist League of North America. And they were radicals, and they joined the Chicago Federation of Labor, And so they were able to get into the Chicago Federation of Labor. And in Chicago in these days, there were meat packing facilities where people, assembled and processed meat. And the conditions in those facilities were very, very awful. And most of the people who worked in those facilities were from Eastern Europe, from Lithuania and Estonia, from Russia. There were, Irish immigrants. There were Italians. And the conditions were awful. There was child labor. Children were working there, getting paid very low wages. Injuries were very common. Workers would lose fingers or get injured on the job, and the bosses wouldn't take care of them. And also the cleanliness was pretty bad too. There was a lot of flies and dirty things. And so in Chicago, the Chicago Federation of Labor decided it wanted to organize the meatpacking workers. And World War I was going on at the time, and a lot of the meat that they were processing went to the soldiers. So William Z. Foster, with the Chicago Federation of Labor, they organized public hearings to expose the conditions of the meatpacking facilities, where workers got up and testified about the conditions, and children talked about the low wages they were being paid, and people showed the fingers that they were missing from machines and how they didn't get compensated by their employers. And they had these public hearings in Chicago just exposing how bad it was, and then they hinted that they might go on strike. Now, it would have been illegal to go on strike because World War I was happening, but they hinted that they might go on strike. And so they had these public hearings, and the media covered it, and the federal government was very worried that there would be a strike, so they sent in the federal government, and they negotiated, and they set up Stockyards Labor Council, and they forced the meatpacking companies of Chicago to sign a union contract. And William Z. Foster organized the meatpacking workers of Chicago. And that was a huge victory. All these workers suddenly, they got guaranteed wages and protections on the job. They had union representation. And that was a huge success. And it was the first major industry, right? This was not a skilled trade, right? Meatpackers were not, they didn't have to go through an apprenticeship. They were industrial workers. This was the first major industrial union victory where an industry was forced to sign union contracts. And that made William Z. Foster quite popular. So then, William Z. Foster, as World War I came to an end, he convinced the American Federation of Labor leaders to let him try to unionize the steel industry. And we know that steel, used to be a very, very big part of the industries of the United States. Cleveland used to have, huge steel mills. Pittsburgh is, the Pittsburgh Steelers because of those steel factories that used to be there. Minneapolis and Chicago, Gary, Indiana, all kinds of places used to have big steel industries. And so William Z. Foster, with the backing of the American Federation of Labor, he started organizing and trying to build for a union effort to unionize the steel industry. And in 1919, 365,000 workers went on strike to try and unionize the steel industry. And it was one of the biggest strikes in American history. And the strike, there was a lot of violence. I have a picture in the textbook here. I'll show you what page it's on. You can see the picture. It's on... it's on page 14. You'll see the picture of Fanny Sellens. And Fanny Sellens was one of the top organizers who worked with William Z. Foster to try and unionize the steel industry. And just before the strike began, she was murdered. She was on a picket line with workers, and she saw a fight breaking out or whatever. She ran over to it, and the police shot her and bludgeoned her to death. And she was killed just as the strike was beginning. And all over the country, the National Guard was called out, and the Great Steel Strike of 1919, it was a national situation because all the steel mills in the country were shut down. Workers were on strike demanding better conditions. And President Woodrow Wilson called William Z. Foster to the White House to urge him to call off the strike. And William Z. Foster told the story of how Woodrow Wilson spoke to him in what he called roughneck talk, because he assumed that William Z. Foster must be an ignorant worker. So he talked to him in what he thought like an ignorant worker would sound like. And he used to tell the story of Woodrow Wilson speaking to him in roughneck talk, and he thought it was pretty funny. They also brought up the fact that William Z. Foster had been a radical, and he was called, before Congress. Congress was investigating this strike, and they had some of William Z. Foster's pamphlets about socialism and revolution. And they said, "Do you still believe this?" And he said, "No, I was young. I was a young radical once, but I'm a patriotic American. I don't believe any of this anymore." And he was, of course, lying because he was definitely a radical. But as the strike went on for months, eventually they lost, and workers started going back to work. And the strike ended in failure. The Great Steel Strike of 1919 was actually a big failure. They weren't able to successfully unionize the steel industry. And the main factor in causing the failure of the strike was racism. That was the main factor, because the AFL unions were for whites only, and the steel mills would only hire white people. And so when the white workers in the steel mills went on strike, black people were used as scab labor, because that was their only chance to work in the steel industry. And so because the unions had a racist policy, the bosses were able to use that against them. And the division of white and black workers caused the failure of the strike. And that William Z. Foster would use that example throughout his life to point to how racism hurts the working class movement, because the fact that the unions had been so hostile and negative to the black community, that caused the black community to then have no problem going to work as scab labor when the white unions that were racist went on strike. And that was a huge setback for the labor movement, that racism hurts all working people. That was a message that William Z. Foster took for the rest of his life. So 1919, the strike failed, and William Z. Foster was considered to be discredited, basically. He failed to lead the strike. It's also important to note the Russian Revolution had happened in 1917, and there were various groups that were trying to form some kind of political party that would be aligned with the Russian Revolution, and none of them supported the strike, because they thought that because it was run by an AFL union, that it was not a real union. They were opposed to the AFL, and so they didn't support the strike. And a lot of the groups that existed, there was a group that called itself the Communist Party, there was the Communist Labor Party, there were other groups, the IWW, they wouldn't support the strike because it was run by a reformist union. And in Gary, Indiana, the Communist Party put up posters everywhere telling the striking workers they should give up their strike and instead violently overthrow the government and form a militia and violently overthrow the government. And the Communist Party and the various groups that had been formed to support the Russian Revolution, they were not sympathetic or helpful during the strike. And they called William Z. Foster Easy Foster because they thought he was a sellout for being part of the AFL. So the strike failed, and after the strike failed, William Z. Foster, he became a railroad worker, and he was working on the railroads, but he got an invitation from Moscow because the Russian Revolution had happened and the Bolsheviks were in power, and they invited William Z. Foster to come to a conference of labor leaders in Moscow. And so he went to this conference, and at the conference he met Vladimir Lenin, and Vladimir Lenin explained to him that he had been urging the American communists to support the strike, and that this idea of boring from within that Foster had thought of, the idea that we need to go into the more radical unions, the Bolsheviks had done the same thing. And Lenin had just written this book called Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, saying that it's foolish to cut yourself off from the working class. You never put any barrier between yourself and the workers. If there's an election, you should run a candidate in order to, because the elections are the only time that a lot of working class people think about politics. So if you don't participate in the elections, you're not, getting access to all those people who are going to hear what you have to say. And if there's a union that's not a revolutionary union and you don't join it, again, you don't get access to engage with all those people. And this concept of boring from within, was something the Bolsheviks had been pushing. And William Z. Foster realized the Bolsheviks had developed the same theory that he had developed, this idea of boring from within. So William Z. Foster came back to the United States, and he and a number of other people, they had a convention in the woods in Bridgman, Michigan. And it was like a secret meeting that they gathered in the woods in Bridgman, Michigan. And William Z. Foster and his supporters, who were calling themselves the Trade Union Educational League, and the Communist Party, and the Communist Labor Party, and a group called the African Blood Brotherhood, which was a group of black people who taught, how to use firearms to protect themselves and taught armed self-defense to African Americans. They all merged into what is now called the Communist Party. In Bridgman, Michigan in 1922, they had the founding convention of the Communist Party in the woods in Bridgman, Michigan. And the convention was raided by the newly formed FBI, and everyone there got arrested, actually. And that was their first convention, and it was held in secret. And that's how the Communist Party of the United States was formed. It was the merger of a number of different organizations. But William Z. Foster was probably the most famous and well-known person because he'd been the leader of the 1919 steel strike, and he was the face of the communist wing of the labor movement that formed during those years. And that was how the Communist Party was formed.
I appreciated some of the history of the unions, and I know that the union movement is very contentious now, and a lot of the times they seem to be somewhat Luddite, like in Long Beach, California, which is one of the major ports. The unions led a fight against actually some technology that's coming from China that greatly automates a lot of the port process. And these automations would save billions of dollars, but they cut out a lot of the labor of the workers, which is an interesting phenomenon. And I know that, like now with the AFL, I like to going into the AFL. I didn't know the situation between the AFL and the IWW. I would be curious to see what's happened with the AFL now, because I know that they're the AFL-CIO, and you see them everywhere, and it's like they're just like this massive, massive thing. And I know a lot of union workers within the union say that the union leadership is totally like bought off in their own thing, and I almost wonder like what the role of unions in the 21st century is, and if they may even kind of be a regressive force preventing further development.
Okay. I just want to piggyback on what he said, that the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, set up by John Dewey, maybe one of the most, influential philosophers in American history. But it was interesting when we watched Mission to Moscow last night, and I was looking through the Wikipedia page, and Dewey was just disgusted by that movie. He said it was outright propaganda, but that clicked with me a lot, that he's not on board with real communism at all. So what is he doing? Is it some sort of social democracy within the union movement? Kind of what Liam was saying? Is it hijacking it? I don't know. That clicked for me in my head.
Well, John Dewey formed something called the Dewey Commission, and it was Trotsky trying to exonerate himself. And so he basically hired John Dewey to put on a fake trial for himself in Mexico to prove that he was innocent. And John Dewey was the head of it, right?
Oh my.
And then afterwards, John Dewey and Trotsky had a big falling out, and Trotsky wrote a book against John Dewey called Their Morals and Ours, and he attacked John Dewey, and John Dewey attacked Trotsky too. John Dewey attacked Trotsky for allegedly believing in violent revolution and believing that the ends justify the means. And Trotsky wrote this book called Their Morals and Ours, attacking John Dewey as a petty moralist and all of that. So they actually had a falling out. But the reason that John Dewey was disgusted by that movie was because Trotsky had basically paid John Dewey to put on this fake trial to acquit him in
Oh,
Mexico.
okay.
Yeah,
Oh, well, that
so
makes sense.
that's a
I'm
side
glad I
note.
asked. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, the thing that I was thinking most about was the contradiction of skilled versus non-skilled labor. I think, like, Marxists need to not be living in museums and be curators of the past. We need to be applying this like scientists to the present. And the most radical question you could ask somebody is your job and what are your feelings about it? Are you getting a pension? I admire you. I have a master's degree and I won't have a pension and I have a really bad retirement plan. I am working class. And think of yourself, there's so many people I meet nowadays who don't think of themselves as working class because they have a college degree, but they're wage labor. And we need to be thinking in new terms of like the gig economy, hybrid, self-employed people who are super exploited or think that they're going to make it someday and they won't. And we need to do what, you haven't gotten to this part yet, but Foster set up trade union educational leagues to teach people that they were wage labor. And the thing that the Italian communists used to do was set up co-ops for the petty bourgeoisie. If you were a laborer, a carpenter or a shoemaker or a watchmaker, they would set up co-ops so you could get insurance, you could buy things together. They were relevant to people's lives. And that was one of the things that Foster was relevant, like he was an educator.
Yeah, I just wanted to like riff off of Liam's point of like like with the AFL-CIO, are they playing a regressive role in the modern day? So that's where I think like labor education is really important. I'm part of a mass org called Labor United Educational League, and their goal is to bring back like the labor movement to its more like militant form like it was in the past. And of course, a lot of that involves like educating shop stewards and union reps on how to fight like the entrenchment in the leadership, and also affiliating with more anti-imperialist labor organizations like the WFTU, the World Federation of Trade Unions, is a lot more radical than some of the other trade union groups that exist out there.
Well, I'll just add before we go on that the labor movement in the United States has never been weaker since like the 1920s than it is now. Most labor union employees are government employees, because government jobs often are required to have a union, and the labor unions spend almost all their money just campaigning for Democrats. But one thing that I frequently hear, and I hear this from both sides, from Democrats and Republicans, is this idea that jobs in steel, jobs in auto manufacturing, they're just magic. They're just magically good-paying jobs, and they're not. Right? They're good-paying jobs because communists built industrial unions and forced the bosses to pay. And that's one thing that's missing from the understanding, and that now that we don't have industry in the United States as much, the main killer of industry has been technology. It's not been offshoring. I mean, offshoring has been part of it, but it's mainly just been technology, that you don't need as much human labor anymore. Because of that, people say, oh, why don't we have those good jobs that used to exist? Well, those good jobs were not always good jobs. The steel mills used to pay about the equivalent of what a fast food worker makes right now. But it wasn't until the 1930s, and we're going to get to that later, that they organized these unions that forced the bosses to pay decent wages in those industries. And so, go ahead.
I have a question for you. It wasn't clear to me why the AFL sold out for World War I. What kind of, did they get economic benefits, or why did they capitulate? And I assume then the Wobblies did not.
Yeah, the Wobblies were smashed because they didn't oppose World War I, but the AFL did support World War I.
But why?
It was illegal. I mean, they put you in jail. The USA became almost a straight-up like dictatorship during World War I. Eugene Debs went to federal prison. We have the speech in here that he gave in Canton, Ohio, and was sentenced to 10 years in prison for giving.
So it's political. You were traitors then.
Yeah. I mean, it was
okay.
completely illegal. And yeah, I mean, if you didn't support World War I, you went to prison. There was actually a case where there was a farmer who made an anti-war comment in his house. Like a police officer's car broke down, and he was helping the police officer, and he made a comment to the police officer like, you know, this war isn't good or something, and he ended up going to prison for that. Like it was crazy. There was a film producer who made a patriotic movie to support the war effort called The Spirit of 1776 because he thought he would have patriotism to support the war, and he went to jail because he portrayed the British as the enemy, and that was hurting the war effort. So, yeah.
I think that law that was used to criminalize Eugene Debs, that law is still in effect today. Yes. That's what they used to try and get out. I'm sorry, I'm stuttering. That's still the same law that they used to try and criminalize Edward Snowden being a whistleblower.
Yeah, the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. Yeah.
Obama had an even worse law at the time. Did they have the Sedition Act?
Yeah.
And is the Selective Service Act still in effect or no?
No, I don't think so.
No.
Well, isn't the Sedition Act what they're trying to get Trump on?
I believe so, yeah. And it's worth noting that, I mean, the Sedition Act, the Espionage Act, these laws were basically passed to outlaw anti-war activism. So when you hear leftists and socialists invoke them around January 6th, you have to be like, what are you doing? Why would you invoke these laws? Because they were set up to silence people like you.
I always want to ask Glenn Greenwald or somebody that really knows, like, how can you have the Constitution over here? How can you have the First Amendment over here and the Espionage Act over here? Like, how? Am I just too simple? Do I not understand the complexity, or what is it?
Yes, but it's not just you.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, it's like, that's true. Like, yeah, you are too simple. It's not
Oh,
just.
okay, all right.
So I don't know if we want to do another Hammer Dulcimer performance or not, but I guess I don't see them around. So I guess when she gets back, we'll do another one. So I guess we can just go on to our next section, and then when they get back, we can do another Hammer Dulcimer performance. So unless there's more discussion, do we want to discuss this? Oh, Irving, you have something? Okay. All right. So should we move on to the next section, or? Sure. Oh, do you want to perform? Go ahead. All right. Perform. Go ahead. No. Go ahead.
Sam, you want us to come around and watch you?
Mill around. Well, pretend this is a coffee house, okay?
Okay. All right.
Okay.
No, you can stay in your seat. You know, obviously, if there's a lot of talking, you won't hear the music so well, but please feel free to visit among yourselves. And this is very casual, okay?
All right. Go
What's
ahead.
on your inner shirt? Like,
Yeah, I'm not going to talk anymore.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, just for the instrument, not the music.
Nah, I'd rather not. 'Cause
Okay.
sometimes it distorts it. It's got a little, what's the word? It catches the ring
Okay,
and makes it
okay.
distort.
Yeah, that's interesting.
All right.
Okay, this one's from the United States. a TV show, and some Americans know it because it was written for Ken Burns' series on the Civil War. Years ago.
That's what I heard.
So he didn't really write it for that. He wrote it at the end of a music camp. He called it Farewell to Ashokan, and everybody thinks it's a Civil War battle. Odessa Ashokan was the name of the music camp, because I was there. So he wrote it at the end of the summer, but later he got involved with the making of this film, and he did all the soundtrack for it with his fiddle. He's an amazing fiddler.
Yeah, that's why I heard the music was the Ken
Yeah,
Burns
so if it
Civil
sounded a little familiar, that's why
Yeah.
it's one thing that well, there's a few things I played. Do you want to hear another one that sounds familiar?
Go ahead, please.
You're going to know this one. Same key. American also.
Oh.
That was Yip Harper, right? That's Yip Harper?
That's somewhere over the ring.
Yeah, was that written by Yip Harper, the composer?
Oh, I don't know. But you know, it's funny because you're talking about capitalism and socialism. It's a very capitalist song, right? From the Hollywood machine. But it does stick with us. It's been popular for decades and decades. Okay, here's one from Ireland. They used to play a lot of Irish traditional music, and so this is some of it. It's some jigs.
Schedule it so we can do the coffee break next, so we'll just do that.
Okay.
But yeah. Okay. Okay, so we're going to have a coffee break now. That's what the schedule says. So we'll resume at 11. All right, so we're reconvening now. And thank you. Let's thank our musician. That was great. Thank you so much. Beautiful. All right. So after the Communist Party was formed, it was the U.S. affiliate of the Communist International. And there was debate about whether they should become a public organization. They were technically illegal. They had been raided by the FBI. A lot of their members had been arrested. But the Supreme Court and the legality changed. Around 1922, 1924, it became legal to be a communist again. But many of them felt that it should be remaining an underground organization. And there was a big debate about should we continue to be a secret organization or not. William Z. Foster organized his group, the Trade Union Educational League, and most labor unions in the country had a ban on communists. If you were a communist, you were immediately kicked out of the union. So his members would conceal that they were communists and join the unions and try to organize them from within. The AFL National Convention, one of the heads of the unions, pointed to William Z. Foster in the audience and said, "This man is who we want nothing to do with. He's Mr. Imposter. He's a fraud. He's a Bolshevik. He's working for the Russians." And the Communist Party was trying in the 1920s to work within the labor unions and organize effectively. But the labor unions were very hostile. And the Socialist Party that ran the labor unions, they said, our main enemy is on the left. And the Communist Party was considered very much to be aligned with the Soviet Union, aligned with Russia. Now, what's also interesting is there were a lot of what they called class war prisoners, people that were arrested for preaching socialism or revolution. There was a famous case of Sacco and Vanzetti, two anarchists, Italian immigrant anarchists who were given the death penalty in Massachusetts. And the communists were organizing all over the world. There were protests all over the world demanding that they be freed. And the 1920s was a particularly rough time. The Communist Party was very divided during those years because there was William Z. Foster had his faction, and then there was another faction led by a guy named J. Lovestone. And what was interesting is no one knew what they really disagreed about. It was not really about politics. It was more about who's friends with who. The Lovestone faction, they wanted to run the Communist Party. They had a lot of people in the labor unions. And Foster's faction, they wanted to run the Communist Party. They had a lot of people in the labor unions. And Stalin gave his famous speeches to the Communist Party, where he sat down J. Lovestone and William Z. Foster and scolded them for the fact they were constantly fighting with each other. And he was particularly angry that both of them had called their faction the Stalinist faction, right? Lenin had died. Stalin was the new leader of the Soviet Union. And so Foster was telling his followers that, I'm the leader of the Stalinist faction. And J. Lovestone had been telling his followers, I'm the leader of the Stalinist faction. And Stalin said to both of them, there's no such thing as a Stalinist, and neither of you are my faction. So stop that. And that was the 1920s. But ultimately, what happened was that so the Communist International, we'll talk about the phases they went through. All right, so immediately after the Russian Revolution, all these people around the world who were attracted to communism because they'd had a violent revolution were trying to form the Communist International, trying to join the communist parties. But a lot of them didn't want to run in elections. They didn't want to join non-revolutionary labor unions. They just wanted to kind of preach violent revolution. So the first period of the Communist International was the fight against ultra-leftism. Right, what they called ultra-leftism, which was this radicalism, refusing to join existing unions, refusing to run an election. So they had the fight against ultra-leftism. And Lenin wrote his book, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. But then after that, they started urging communists to try and build the United Front. And the idea was that communists would organize around things that other labor unions and other left-wing people agreed with. And they would try to have united action between the social democratic labor unions and the anarchists and others. They would try to have a united front around causes that they agreed with. And that was what they spent the 1920s, going into labor unions, trying to push them in a more revolutionary direction. And in response to that, the Social Democrats and the leaders of the American Federation of Labor became very, very hostile, banning communists from unions, preaching that communists were the main threat. And there was a lot of disagreement inside the Soviet Union, like Lenin died, and then Trotsky was fighting with Stalin, and there was a lot of disagreement. So then in 1928, you had a very important event, which was the Sixth World Congress. And at the Sixth World Congress of the Communist International, That's when Stalin solidified his leadership over the Communist International. And the Bukharinites, that were called the right opposition, they were kicked out. And the Trotskyites, that were called the left opposition, they were kicked out. And in 1928, Stalin solidified his leadership. And at the 1928 Congress, the slogan became class against class. And the idea was that social democrats were the main enemy because they were holding back revolution, and the focus of communists should be on exposing the social democrats. And they predicted that the Great Depression was going to happen. There was going to be an economic crisis, the Great Depression, and when that happened, the working class would be desperate, people would be hungry and starving, and in that period it was really important that they be organized to have a revolution. They not join the social democratic reformist leaders. So 1928 was the Sixth World Congress. Well, 1929, the American Communist Party had a convention, and Jay Lovestone and his followers said that the Sixth World Congress didn't apply to the United States. They said that American capitalism was so efficient that the Great Depression wasn't going to happen in the United States. It might happen for the rest of the world, but the United States was so different. So Stalin kicked Jay Lovestone out of the Communist Party for American exceptionalism. That's actually where the phrase American exceptionalism comes from. If you Google American exceptionalism, it goes back to Jay Lovestone, the leader of the American Communist Party, was kicked out for American exceptionalism, saying that America was the exception to the Marxist economic theories. And so Jay Lovestone was kicked out of the Communist Party. So William Z. Foster became pretty much the leader because his main opponent was kicked out for American exceptionalism. Now, during these years, there was a very important strike. And this photo, it's in your book, but you take a look at this photo. This is a National Guard soldier facing off with a very, very poor woman. This was in Gastonia, North Carolina. So Gastonia is a city in North Carolina, and there was textile mills of where black and white workers were employed. And it was the South, it was Jim Crow segregation, and the textile workers of North Carolina were paid very poor, impoverished wages. So the communists formed the National Textile Workers Union because no one was organizing them. The idea was to organize the unorganized. And so all these workers in the Textile Workers Union, black and white, they had to have, by law, they were required to have a wire down the middle of the room to divide the black and white workers. They went on strike to demand better conditions in their textile factory in Gastonia, North Carolina. Well, they all lived in houses that were owned by the company. So as soon as they went on strike, they were all kicked out of their homes, and the National Guard was called in to evict them all out of their homes. And so they set up a tent encampment, and so they all lived in tents because they'd been thrown out of their homes because they were on strike. And the workers guarded their encampment with firearms. They all had rifles. This is the South. They all had their guns, and they protected their encampment. 24 hours a day, they had an encampment. And the Communist Party mobilized thousands of people from around the country to go to Gastonia to support the textile workers, to bring food for the textile workers' families, and to support the textile workers in their demand that they get better treatment and union recognition on the job. So, the textile worker plant, it was hiring scab labor. So one night, the workers assembled, and they were going to shut down the plant. They were going to block the scab labor from going in. They were going to stop the night shift. So they carried their firearms, and they marched down to the plant to block the scabs from getting in. The police then opened fire on the march, and they dispersed immediately and went back to the encampment. When they got to the encampment, the police demanded that they hand over their firearms because they didn't want them carrying firearms around, and they refused to do so. And so there was a shootout, and the police chief was killed. And two leaders of the Communist Party, Fred Beale, and I forget the other guy's name, but two leaders of the Communist Party were charged with killing the police officer. And that was in Gastonia, North Carolina. And they were both charged with murder for killing this police officer because there'd been a shootout at this tent encampment. So the Communist Party raised their bail money, raised thousands and thousands of dollars to get them out on bail, and then smuggled them to the Soviet Union, and they lived in the Soviet Union. And that was Gastonia, North Carolina. It was a very important strike because all over the country, people were trying to support the Gastonia workers. They had their encampment, and it was a very, very famous labor incident. And that's a photo from Gastonia of this low-income worker, confronting a National Guard man with his rifle there, and you can see that. And that was a famous incident that happened. One of the key organizers of the strike was a woman named Ella Mae Wiggins, and we have a picture of her as well. You can see a picture of her on page
20.
page 20, and she was murdered. She was going to a union meeting. She was in her car, and they ambushed her car, and she was killed. Yeah. And so that was one of the key struggles that was going on during those years. But then the Great Depression did happen, right? 1929, the stock market crashed, and the U.S. economy, went into free fall. And so the Communist Party started organizing unemployment councils. And the idea was that unemployed people would go and demand that the government provide them with economic relief. And so they started having hunger marches, they would call, where they'd assemble thousands and thousands of unemployed people to go to City Hall, to go to government buildings, to go to Washington, D.C., to demand that they provide food and emergency relief. The slogan that the communists used, they said, "Don't starve, fight." And, the conditions of the Great Depression were pretty extreme. There were deaths of malnutrition happening all throughout the United States. People were hungry, they were desperate, and the Communist Party became the organization that was organizing the unemployed, and they would assemble crowds of thousands and thousands of hungry people to go and demand, that they be provided with economic relief. And the unemployment councils were in every neighborhood and every city. And actually, the account of the New York City unemployment march, so March 6th, 1930, became International Unemployment Day. And the Communist International called for protests of unemployed people in every country in the world. So in New York City, they had International Unemployment Day. So Christina is going to read us the account of what happened on International Unemployment Day, 1930. Come on up.
Oh, am I going?
Yeah.
You? Okay. On March 6th, the New York City mayor canceled all of his appointments for the day. Police with rifles were positioned on the roofs of all the buildings surrounding Union Square. 250 police assembled to protect City Hall from any possible attack. The Communist Party set up 5 different stages in Union Square, and the crowd that assembled was much larger than any of the organizers and city officials had anticipated. James R. Barrett's biography, William Z. Foster and the Tragedy of American Radicalism, describes the dramatic events of the day. Quote, "In New York City, between 50 and 100,000 protesters waited in Union Square across from the Communist Party headquarters for permission to march. The mood was tense. Foster led a committee in negotiations with the police commissioner Grover Whalen, who offered his car to transport the committee to City Hall but refused the party's request for a parade permit. Foster mounted the speaker's stand. Al Richmond, a young communist organizer, later recalled the scene. Foster stood on the central platform, tall and erect, his figure against the sun. The city authorities said he had handed over the streets to every monarchist and militarist exploiter of Europe and America, but had denied them to the unemployment workers of New York. Will you take that for an answer? Foster asked. The crowd roared, "No! Then I advise you to fall in line and proceed," he shouted, pointing in the direction of City Hall. Thousands poured out onto Broadway singing the Internationale and started what New York Times called the worst riot in generations. 1,000 policemen immediately waded into the crowd, flailing away with blackjacks and nightsticks. The crowd pelted them with bricks. What followed, Richmond recalled, is a hazy jumble in my mind. The roar of motorcycles, the whine of sirens. The square was filled with screams. Demonstrators, some of them drenched in blood, ran in all directions. By the time the bloody fighting had subsided, 4 policemen and more than 100 civilians were injured. Amid the melee, Foster and his committee made their way to City Hall and were promptly arrested and charged with serious felonies: incitement of riot, assault of the second degree, and conspiracy. As soon as he was released, Foster promptly confronted New York City Mayor Jimmy Walker and presented him with a list of demands on behalf of the March 6th demonstration. Foster employed his most aggressive language with Jimmy Walker, the kind of slick politician for whom he had contempt. You cannot cure unemployment except by the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a Soviet government in the United States. Later, at his trial, Foster predicted that the growing army of unemployed are not going to starve on the streets. They are going to fight. The problem of unemployment, in the final analysis, Foster argued, can only be solved by the abolition of the capitalist system and the establishment of a workers' and farmers' government. The Communist Party and the Trade Union Unity League organized the most unemployed, not only for the purpose of these immediate demands, but for the revolutionary goal.
Yeah. So William Z. Foster organized that huge demonstration in New York City that he was then arrested and sent to prison for, I think, 8 or 9 months for inciting a riot. And as soon as he got out of prison, he decided to run for president on the Communist Party ticket. And this is an actual election campaign poster.
Campaign poster ever.
And you can see it says vote communist, and it says equal rights for Negroes everywhere, and self-determination for the black belt. Now this is a map of the United States in this region, and that refers to a position that the Communist International took, that they argued that black people constituted a nation. They were not simply a group of people in the United States that faced discrimination, but they were an oppressed nationality. And as a nation, they had the right to self-determination. And the Black Belt region of the South, which is actually called black because of the soil, because that's where the richest soil is, and that's where the slave plantations were located. And it's still, even today, the highest concentration of black Americans. That region, they argued, had the right to secede from the United States because it was a colony, because the people there were a colonized people. Black people were an oppressed nation within U.S. borders. And so he ran for president on the platform of creating what he called a Soviet America, right? He wrote a book called Towards Soviet America, laying out what the USSA would look like, the United Soviet States of America. And a big part of his campaign was self-determination for the Black Belt region. And the Communist Party, it's important to note, was really the only major organization in the country that advocated equal rights for black people at the time. The Socialist Party was supporting Jim Crow segregation. Talking about Jim Crow was something that was pretty much forbidden. But the Communist Party talked about it. And William Z. Foster, fresh out of prison, ran for president. And he went to every major city in the United States. And almost every city he went to, as soon as he got off the train, he was arrested and charged with inciting a riot or criminal anarchy or whatever. He was arrested hundreds of times in 1932. He was beaten up and tortured, etc. So much so that at the end of his presidential campaign, he had a massive heart attack. And he had to go to the Soviet Union for medical care. And that was 1932. But this was the period where, basically the U.S. economy had crashed. So many people were hungry and unemployed. And the Communist Party was saying, revolution. Revolution is the answer. We need to overthrow the government. We need to establish a Soviet government in the United States. And that we need to build a Soviet America to solve it. And that they also focused on opposing the Socialist Party and the AFL unions, who they considered to be the main roadblock to revolution. It's also important to understand that while the rest of the world was having a Great Depression, including the United States, the Soviet Union was booming economically. This is when Stalin was industrializing the whole country, and he was building the world's largest hydroelectrical power plants and steel mills, and a lot of American engineers and American scientists and American industrialists were going over to the Soviet Union and being hired by Stalin to build the country up. The Koch brothers, you've heard of the Koch brothers. Well, their father, Fred Koch, was a chemist, and Stalin hired him to organize the Soviet oil industry. And the Koch brothers, millions come from the Soviet Union because Stalin hired them to go build the oil industry. And many of the greatest filmmakers and engineers and scientists and others were going to the Soviet Union and saying, wow, our country's falling apart economically, but the Soviet Union is rising. And so the Soviet Union would say, well, if you really like what you see over here, when you get back to America, you ought to join the Communist Party. And a lot of very highly educated people from Harvard and Yale and people like that were joining the Communist Party because they thought that the Soviet Union was the future, because it was industrializing and it was building and it was raising the country up, and the Western countries were falling apart economically. And this was the period from 1928 to 1935. This is a period that people generally call the third period Where the Communist International, they taught that after World War I, there were 3 different periods. Immediately after World War I, there had been the Russian Revolution, there had been uprisings in different countries, there had been revolts, that was the first period. But then you had the 1920s, which was a period of capitalist stabilization. But then they argued that they had entered what they called the 3rd period. And the 3rd period was the collapse of capitalism, and it was time for a revolution. So as workers around the world and were rising up and demanding jobs and unemployment, and as the Communist Party was growing in membership, around the world there was something else that was rising, which was fascism. And we know there was an attempted military coup against Roosevelt in 1934, the business plot. Many American capitalists felt that Roosevelt was not doing enough to stop the communist uprisings, etc., and they wanted a fascist dictatorship. Hitler came to power in Germany. Mussolini was already in power in Italy, and there was a fear that communist revolution would come, and so fascism was rising as the alternative to communist revolution. So why don't we discuss that for 5 minutes, and then we'll reconvene and talk about it. And thank you, Christina. So what stood out for people? What stood out? Let's reconvene. What stood out? What questions or thoughts do people have?
I wanted to focus on the Communist International basically telling what the American Communist Party what to do, and the pros and cons with that. Because obviously you can learn lessons from it, but I don't know whether or not the black nationalist element was really popular amongst African Americans in the South. It was something that was dictated from above, maybe. I don't know, above or outside.
That's a whole different question. This is about fascism, right?
No, we're talking about.
We're just talking about, yeah.
And that particular question, I think, is something that we need to talk about, whether or not an outside force, even though it's a communist international, can decide what can be done domestically here, or should be best done by the Communist Party. Also, the other question at that period of time in 28 was also a period of time when it was before the Depression, but the decision within the Soviet Union was basically for the Soviet Union, the 3rd period. And with Stalin felt it was necessary to defend the Soviet Union, the industrialization question. And maybe, I think Jay Lovestone may have said, look, this is not us. We're in a different situation. We maybe didn't understand the response. But he felt was intrusion.
And this was a problem. When the Communist International eventually dissolved during World War II, Mao said it was a great thing that it dissolved because they hadn't been listening to them for the past 5 or 6 years anyway. And that this was a problem. The fact that the communist parties around the world were all kind of beholden to the Soviet Union and doing what the Soviet Union said, that limited them politically. And, like Jay Lovestone, for example. Jay Lovestone didn't agree with what the Soviet Union instructed the American Communist Party to do. And so he quit, and where did Jay Lovestone end up? He ended up being the CIA's main trade union guy. And he had an office in the Ronald Reagan White House, and he was like the CIA's trade union organizer. But he spent the 1930s trying to get back into the Communist Party. He said, I agree with you guys, I just don't think you have the right orientation about the labor movement. But he was on the outs, and that it seemed like the Soviet Union kind of controlling the various communist parties, telling them what to do, and the communist parties also being kind of like, you're either with us or against us. Right? That was a problem.
Combination.
Yeah, it was a problem. Now, as far as the black belt thesis, right? And this is an important nuance, right? If the majority of black Americans did feel that they were a nation and did want to have a separate territory and government, I would support that. But they don't at this time. You know what I mean? There is a black nationalist current, the Nation of Islam, and and all of that, but they are not a majority among black people. And for me as a white person to go around telling black people, you should have your own country, you should have a separate country, that sounds like segregation. It doesn't sound good. So, and it's a little bit weird because some of the Maoist groups still do hold up this map and still do go around talking about we want that, and that's a little bit weird. You know what I'm saying? There's also the Sun Belt, Aztlan, right? A lot of communist groups maintain that they want the parts of the USA that used to be part of Mexico to separate and become their own country. And the same for the indigenous territories. Right? Native Americans wanted to separate. Again, if these groups wanted that, right, I would support it. But I don't feel it's right for communists in the United States to go around advocating this when the groups of people that that this is for don't want it. So that's kind of, there's a nuanced position there. I do think that black nationalism is important because it is the most revolutionary, it's one of the most revolutionary currents in the country, right? Black nationalists tend to side with people around the world that are fighting against American imperialism. We're defending the Uhuru movement. They don't call themselves black nationalists, they call themselves African internationalists, but they believe that all African people should be one country, and so because of that, they're for basically the independence of the Black Belt because they view black people in the United States as separating from the United States, and we support them because they're under attack right now. They've been indicted by the American government and charged with being Russian agents and such. So it's important to express sympathy for and align with black nationalists, but I also don't think it's correct to go around advocating separation, right, at this time, especially when your organization is primarily white people. It doesn't make any sense, right? If there was, to support Malcolm X, when Malcolm X was a rising leader of the black community and he was calling for separation, that's different. But nowadays, to just go around talking about you want a separate nation, it doesn't make any sense. What do you think?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that. So a couple of things. One thing about like the Soviet Union dictating like what other communist parties in other countries should do. So my understanding of that is that the communist movement worldwide is strongest when there is unity amongst all the various different communist groups that do exist, whether it's in the Soviet Union or in other countries. When there was a split and a divide in that movement, that was when they became weakened. And that's when the communist movement like really, was divided and it kind of split apart. The other thing about the Black Belt thesis, if you read Stalin's book on like what constitutes a nation, he writes about how like a nation is it's a specific thing. It's a place where people share a common territory, a common language, and a common economic life. And that was something that was applicable during that period of time for the black people that were living in this Black Belt area. And of course, conditions change, and there were like mass migrations of black people like up north. And so what was appropriate for that period of time is no longer true. I think even William Z. Foster himself abandoned the Black Belt thesis because of the changing conditions. So those were just a couple of things I wanted to add.
All right, Leo?
I just was thinking that that strategy of trying, while it is good to support people if they really feel that way, but it is very important, I think, as an American or as anyone across the world to realize that the strategy of particularly the British Empire around the world has always been to divide and conquer by splitting people up based on different ethnicities or based on maybe religious different beliefs, and that way they could split into two nations. And what that does is that shatters the actual national economic development that you could see within a country to develop itself as a national industrial power and actually move to a higher mode of production. Because if you could have these ethnic and racial boundaries and split America up into different groups, well, then suddenly the actual national infrastructural developments that make the country richer and stronger can be split up into different economic zones, and the power of association and the economic growth you see from people coming together and working on different industries together can be split. And I think that has been a long-term strategy that people have used against the United States. You see it with the land back movement. Why is Jeff Bezos invested in the land back movement? Mm-hmm. He's not a Native American. He has nothing to do with those people at all. And it's sick to see the way that they try and weaponize that stuff against our country. And I think as patriotic people, we should always stand against that.
I think we need to support the Amazon Web Service back movement. Give it back to me. I wanted to bring up, have you ever heard of Fire on the Mountain, the Terry Bison novel? I don't know if I said that right or not, but it kind of brings a lot of this stuff together. Like it's, people hate alternative history, but I think it's interesting. It's interesting ideas to think through. Like it imagines if John Brown had been successful, and pretty much it's like if the Black Belt did happen right after the Civil War. And then it says in the novel that that would have been like a socialist state, and to think that through. But the most interesting thing to me in it is in their world, in that there's a history book called John Brown's Body, and it describes a world in which Brown failed and was executed. The slaves were emancipated by Lincoln rather than by themselves after a war between two white factions, and capitalism survived as a political and economic system. It is considered a dystopia, describing a horrible world in all ways inferior to the one which the people in the book know. So that might change it up if that was a socialist nation. That might have changed things up.
Yeah, there you go. So I think Jacob, and then Shruti, and then Will, right?
Yeah. So, who wanted to go next?
Jacob, and then Shruti, and then Will.
Something interesting that I've found basically is like with the whole like black self-determination is that there has been black people that have been going and living in parts of Africa like Kenya and like Uganda, and then when they go and do the policy that they want to do there, America threatens them with sanctions and all this type of stuff. So it seems like they're going to be put in this catch-22 situation where they get filled with either choose Democrat over here, or if they try to go and do their own self-determination in another country, then they're going to get punished for it by America. So,
Very good. Or Shruti, and then Will. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up another like point that could be confusing for some people is the distinction between a nation and a state. So a state doesn't necessarily have, like a nation doesn't have to be its own state. A nation can be, or a state can be a federation of nations, right? So you can have, for example, in the Soviet Union and in China, there are like autonomous regions where there are specific areas where there are groups of people that constitute their own nation, but they are still part of the state of the Soviet Union or the state of China. And so they do have, you know, they might have their own policies that are more aligned with their religion or their language or, you know, their particular way of life, but they are still part of the larger state. They still abide by the rules of the larger state. So that was just another distinction I wanted to make.
How do I start? Black people had agency within the Communist Party, so the Black Belt thesis evolved and changed, and W.E.B. Du Bois, Patterson, Paul Robeson became the leadership of the party, even though Du Bois and Paul Robeson never joined because they couldn't. It would have damaged them. But they became the leadership, and black people had agency within the party and were able to change the agenda away from like an alien idea that Stalin implanted. And it continued all the way until Angela Davis left in like 90. Partly she left because she should have been the head of the party and wasn't. I was allied with the faction that left Angela Davis. She is a wonderful woman, and Charlene Mitchell was the first black woman to run for the vice president with Gus Hall. I think it was 68. Black people had agency in the party. My mom would tell me that was where, as a Syrian immigrant, she met Jews and she met black people. Like, there was a dynamic going on. There was dialogue.
Okay. Yeah.
Ladies first.
Okay. I just wanted to say something about Angela Davis. So personally, I feel like Angela Davis is one of those figures who was progressive played a progressive role at one point and a regressive role at another point in time. So Angela Davis actually had connections with the New Left movement, and she learned a lot about the New Left movement through, I forgot what his name was. It was a
Herbert
particular.
Marcuse, yeah.
Yes, Herbert Marcuse. She was a student of his, and so she separated. I suppose she betrayed. I see it as like she betrayed the communist movement because she got more into the New Left aspect of civil rights rather than staying true to the roots of communist thinking.
Thank you. I was having a conversation. I'm sorry, your name again?
Trudy.
I was having a conversation with Trudy, about, and I believe I had one with you yesterday as well, about one of the things that scared me about the Communist Party back when it was in the USSR was that there was no freedom of speech as far as criticizing the government, or there was no freedom of the press, that it was all state-owned, and basically the state dictated what was in, or what the press was allowed to publish, And to me, growing up here in the United States, with freedom of the press, freedom of speech, to be able to criticize the government, which I have done, in times past, was kind of like scaring me. But Fruity was, explaining that sometimes, criticism of the government or being allowed to write whatever you want, in a press publication can be counterproductive, in a way, so.
Okay, so the first thing to understand, and that's a really important question that you're raising, right, is that freedom historically is based on development. The more prosperous and economically developed a society is, the more freedom you have. However, when societies are impoverished, they become much more authoritarian. Feudalism was way more authoritarian than capitalism, right? And we hope to eventually have a socialism that replaces capitalism in the world, and eventually give rise to communism, a world of complete and total freedom, right, where there's no coercion of any kind. But the road to freedom is economic development. And that the Soviet Union, it was surrounded, it was under attack, and it was basically in a state of war for its entire existence. And because they were in such conditions, they were trying to rapidly industrialize. They didn't have the open freedoms that you have in Western society. But that's not good. That's not a strength. That's not something we should think was a good thing about them. And I am sure that many people in the Soviet Union really wished that their country could have the open and level of freedom that we have in the West, but it wouldn't have been possible, right, at that time. That's an important thing to understand. The other point about all of that is that I had a really important conversation with some people in Iran. And Iran is, it's an anti-imperialist revolutionary government. And they pointed out that in Iran, they have elections. They vote for the president. But they have this thing called the Guardian Council. And it's a group of Islamic revolutionary scholars who approve and disapprove the various candidates, right? And they review the people who run for president or run for the Congress or the parliament or whatever. And if they're true to the Islamic principles, they're approved. And if they determine that they're not, they don't approve them, right? And when I was talking to the Iranians about this, they said, we don't have a pure democracy in Iran. It's a guided democracy. And they said, and so you have the exact same thing in America, except it's called Wall Street. It's called the big corporations. And they decide who's a real candidate and who's not, who gets media attention, and that's how it works. And they said, if you're going to have a guided democracy, is it better to have your democracy guided by the people who led the revolution, broke your country free from imperialism, and developed a plan to raise it up out of poverty? Or is it better to be, guided by whoever just happens to have the most money, right? And that the road to true democracy is economic development and moving toward eventually having socialism and raising people up out of poverty. But as long as there is inequality in society, some people are going to have more access and more influence over the government than others. The question is, who is that? Is it the people who led your revolution, or is it the people who just happen to rule by de facto? Right? And that's kind of how these things work. And we live in a dictatorship here in the United States, but it's a more open dictatorship, right? We can have events like this, right? In other countries where the government may not be as secure, right? Where there's the threat of a revolt, or it's not as economically prosperous, you couldn't have events like this, right? So we can recognize that. And we can also recognize that people in socialist countries often feel very frustrated and stifled, right? And because of the fact that their country is in a situation where you can't just say whatever you think and all of that, and that's not good. And then unfortunately, the American imperialists are very, very good at, pointing toward that and saying, oh, look, how frustrating it is that you can't speak and you can't be free. When I was in Russia, a lot of Russian young people, they have to download VPNs on their phone in order to look at Twitter and Facebook, and they feel like, well, this is brutal authoritarian dictatorship. And I'm saying, well, you can download a VPN and you don't get arrested for it. I mean, you can still get on there, but you do understand your country is like fighting for its life in Ukraine right now, and you're not in the same conditions the United States has, and your government is trying to stop the Ukrainians that are hiring people over Facebook and Twitter to go bomb places and murder people and shoot up concerts. And it's a different situation, and different circumstances tend to allow for that. And it's also important to point out that every country in the world, including the United States, if the state of war, if the Congress actually declares war, the Bill of Rights is null and void. Did you know that? During World War II, the Bill of Rights was completely null and void. Right? It was illegal during World War II when Congress actually declared war. If you protested World War II, you went to jail, right? I mean, and all kinds of people did. And World War I was the same thing. If Congress actually declares a war, all the Bill of Rights goes away immediately. That's Japanese internment, right? That was a complete violation of those folks' rights. But the reason they were able to do that was because when they declare a state of war, all of the rights are null and void. And that's every Western country has that. Britain, France, Germany, and all of that. If they are in a state of war, the military runs the country and freedoms go away. So I think that's an important point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to that point also, I was listening to interviews by Victor Grossman, this American who defected to the East Germany, the DDR, and he was there for decades until I think past the domination of West Germany over East Germany. And the way he put it was, I mean, there was debate, there was opposition, but it wasn't a loud public thing because, I mean, there was Radio Free Europe on everyone's radio station. They could take anything the West hears, they can take and use it, twist the facts in a way to undermine whatever country they're targeting. And but people and. There was always an avenue for that if you were in the party or just by yourself, whatever, in your own thing. But it wasn't ever like a movie like what George Lucas says. You just had to be careful about criticizing the government in your movies. But his Soviet film director friends had way more creative freedom than he did than in America, because it's all the profit, the dollar that dictates what goes on and what does not go on. And Victor put it, I think pretty succinctly, in saying that in the former Eastern Bloc countries that were very under attack and all that, you maybe weren't able to criticize the government as much, but you're able to criticize your boss. Because how many people can criticize their boss and get away with it and not get any consequences for that? And that's your everyday life, no matter what happens, no matter who's in charge. I mean, that's your everyday life. And mind you, I also heard that in the 1936 Constitution draft by Stalin, he actually, for better or for worse, wanted an open debate election. And it didn't end up passing. The rest of the party apparently didn't want that. Regardless, the people were very well informed and involved in their government. So, usually they ended up with the representatives that actually represented them. They're very involved, but that's what I'm going to say for that.
Okay, shall we continue?
Yeah, I just
go
wanted
ahead,
to
please.
say, I mean, to think about that, I feel like I'm in a country where I can criticize the government. I mean, unless you hit Julian Assange level, and then you can't.
Yeah.
But you can criticize the government, and it never changes. Or in another country where you can't criticize the government, and everything's changing in a positive direction. But there's also, where we're at here, there's certain things I'm not going to say on this if we put it on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Because maybe you can even technically say it, but it will go nowhere. Mm-hmm. And it's just interesting that we're literally living in that right now.
Well, a big element in freedom of speech is not just your ability to just say what you want, it's the ability to get your message out there.
Absolutely.
Right? Freedom of the press depends on who owns the press. And in our age in particular, it's the social media outlets, right? I mean, they're controlled by very, very wealthy corporations that have an agenda, right? And yeah, I can log on to Twitter and maybe say everything I want within reason, right? But when we have the FBI sitting there, controlling who goes viral and who doesn't, which has been revealed, I mean, freedom of speech is not just a question of your ability to say it and not face consequences. It's also the ability of people to hear you. And I think that's an aspect of that debate that's very important. So do we want to move on to the next section then, or more comments? Or okay, all right, we'll move on to the next section because we got lunch coming up too soon, right? Cool. So yeah, should be a good lunch. So at 1 o'clock, yeah. All right. Okay. So 1935. You had the 7th World Congress. The Communist parties have been growing by leaps and bounds all over the Western world, leading unemployed demonstrations. This 1934, the year before 1935, is probably one of the most important years in American history. The summer of 1934 was a summer of uprisings across the United States. 1934, the dock workers of San Francisco went on strike, led by the Communist Party. The dock workers' unions, they had unions before, but every time they went on strike, the black community would be brought in as scab labor, and the strike would be broken. But this time, because the Communist Party was known to be so in favor of civil rights, the leaders of the Communist Party went to all the black churches in San Francisco and made a deal that if they could win union recognition on the docks, they would hire black people to work on the docks. They would demand a hiring hall so that they controlled who got hired to be a longshore worker, and they would make sure that a certain percentage of the jobs went to black people. So when the dock workers went out on strike in San Francisco in 1934, the black community supported the strike, and they won. And they created the International Longshore Warehouse Union, which is still today one of the most radical unions. And dock workers in San Francisco make very good wages. And then in Minneapolis, the Teamsters went on strike and demanded that there be no scab trucks in the town. And they stood around the city with baseball bats, and if you had not a personal car, but any truck that was being driven, you had to have a pass from the union. And if you didn't have it, they would bash the windows of your truck open. And they forced Minneapolis to let truck drivers be members of a union. In Minneapolis, you had the Teamsters organized Minneapolis into a union. Toledo, Ohio, the auto light workers went on strike and won their demands, a general strike. And all throughout the South, sharecroppers and textile workers were going on strike. And in 1934, the summer of 1934, there was uprisings happening. In San Francisco, that dock workers strike, the Communist Party controlled key areas of the city. In Minneapolis, they controlled, the union ran Minneapolis. They were patrolling the streets, no scab trucks. They had armed patrols. When they would have their nightly union meetings, they would have, big speakers that would blast out their message throughout the whole city. They were running Minneapolis, and they were running Toledo, Ohio. And you had major cities that were under the control of communist-led unions, and it was a summer of revolt. And in response to the 1934 strike wave, Roosevelt was facing an increased amount of pressure because the capitalists thought this guy is not holding back communist revolution enough, and there was that attempted coup against him, the business plot, where several well-known businessmen approached Smedley Butler, who was a former Marine Corps general, and tried to get him to organize a coup. And Roosevelt was facing being overthrown. So Roosevelt, realizing that he was facing the threat of being overthrown and facing a military coup, he then, at that point, he started creating all kinds of progressive reforms. And he started supporting the labor movement because the labor movement were people who would have his back against the people trying to overthrow him. In 1935, Roosevelt hired millions of unemployed workers and put them to work building Key West Highway, building post offices all over the country, building LaGuardia Airport. So much infrastructure was built as Roosevelt was hiring the unemployed. And in Moscow, they had the 7th World Congress of the Communist International. And they saw the rise of fascism around the world. And they said that capitalism is naturally moving toward fascism. In order to save capitalism from the threat of communist revolution, they're going to have to implement fascist dictatorship. And fascism is more than just a dictatorship. The economics of fascism is when capitalism is having a severe economic crisis, lots of unemployment, lots of hunger. A section of the ruling class takes control of the government and uses the government to suppress other sections of the ruling class. The capitalists begin fighting with each other. One section of the capitalist class takes power and seizes control of the government, and then it forces down the economy. It reboots the economy with degrowth, with destruction. It starts destroying means of production. It creates a class of slave laborers. There's all kinds of mechanisms that are used to try and stabilize the capitalist economy with forcible degrowth. It is when the liberal Western capitalist societies collapse into authoritarian dictatorship and the state then starts basically killing people, militarizing the economy, creating a slave labor underclass in order to try and stabilize the system out of economic necessity. And that's what Nazi Germany was. Hitler took power, and when he took power, he immediately put all the Communist Party leaders and all the Social Democratic leaders in concentration camps, and they started doing free labor for corporations as slave laborers, and they started renting those slave laborers out to various corporations, and then he restarted military spending, and he canceled all the debt to American and British banks, and for the couple of years, Germany's economy went pretty strong because they had gotten rid of unemployment. They'd hired all these people to start building bombs and tanks and weapons. They'd canceled the debt to American banks. And on top of that, all kinds of people got jobs, running, being guards at concentration camps, setting up and building concentration camps, etc. And so the Nazis, with degrowth methods, were able to stabilize the German economy for a few years. And that's what fascism is. It is saving capitalism with degrowth. So the Communist International argued that capitalism was naturally leading toward fascism. That was really the only way the capitalists could stay in power, was setting up a fascist dictatorship and degrowing the economy. So they argued that many, many people would be against fascism. And the communists could sit at the center of an anti-fascist coalition, or a people's front, or a popular front. And that they would lead an anti-fascist coalition. And because communists had the understanding of capitalism and its problems, they would be the most effective anti-fascist fighters. And this was a flip, because before the communists had been saying that the Social Democrats and the liberals were the main enemy. Now the communists were organizing the Social Democrats and liberals and saying, let's build a popular front, a united front against fascism. And that's a flip, that's a reverse, but it was necessary because conditions had changed. The rise of fascism changed the circumstances. Social Democrats were no longer the main threat. Fascism was the main threat. So the communists started building anti-fascist people's fronts. And in the United States, it took the form of ultra-patriotism. They used to talk about how you could always tell who was a member of the Communist Party because they were the only people who knew all 5 verses of the Star-Spangled Banner, because the communists were the most ultra-patriotic. And, they began their meetings with the Pledge of Allegiance, and they would sing the national anthem, and that they were ultra-patriotic, and they were arguing that America's history, we're a democratic country, we reject fascism. And they supported Roosevelt because Roosevelt was against fascism and Roosevelt was aligning with the labor movement. And in 1936, Roosevelt ran for re-election. He was running for re-election, and almost all the wealthy capitalists were against Roosevelt because he was hiring the unemployed, because he was taking these dramatic moves, and because the country was having all these communist revolts and uprisings and he wasn't stopping it. So all the factory owners and all the capitalists pretty much wanted to get rid of Roosevelt. But all the workers who he'd hired to work at the unemployed, to work at the Works Progress Administration, they liked him because he was providing them with jobs and housing, and the labor movement liked him. And Roosevelt won the 1936 election in a landslide in 1936. The Communist Party didn't officially endorse Roosevelt. They ran their own candidate, Earl Browder, for president. But Earl Browder said, the essence of my campaign is about defeating the Republicans. So it was basically, the Communist Party, they were supporting Roosevelt, they were supporting the Democrats, and they were running their own campaign to get their own message out there, but they really wanted people to vote for Roosevelt. So Roosevelt won the 1936 election. And many employers had told their workers that if Roosevelt gets reelected, we will lay you off. And that was one way that they were trying to get workers to not vote for Roosevelt. And which is illegal now, by the way. But that was going on, and people were being threatened. If Roosevelt wins, you're going to lose your job. Well, after Roosevelt won, there were mass layoffs, and it started in Akron, Ohio. Rubber workers were getting laid off because Roosevelt had won. So they occupied their factory, and they didn't just go on strike outside the factory with picket signs. They sat down and they occupied their factory. And the company, with their property, with their factory being seized, was forced to give in and sign a union contract with them. And this happened all across the country. The biggest one was in Flint, Michigan, 1937. In Flint, Michigan, auto workers occupied their factory and refused to leave. Thousands of workers came from all over the country to support them. And so we talked about the AFL. Well, the AFL had a faction within it called the Committee for Industrial Organization that wanted to organize factory workers. And the leader of it was a miners' union leader named John L. Lewis. And John L. Lewis, he wanted to support the sit-down strike wave, and the story goes that he was at a meeting of the AFL and he punched a guy in the face who insulted him or something, and then they quit the AFL and they formed a new labor federation called the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. So the CIO was formed, And unlike the AFL, the CIO had no ban on communists. It was, and they immediately started hiring hundreds of communist people to be their labor union organizers. And in Flint, Michigan, when the workers occupied their factory, John L. Lewis went to Flint, Michigan, and he said, if they send the National Guard into Flint, Michigan to drive them out, they're going to have to shoot me. And he ripped his shirt open and said, they'll shoot me if I, and thousands of people went to Flint, Michigan to support the sit-down strikers. And, Chrysler was forced to sign a contract with the United Auto Workers. I think it was General Motors was forced to sign a contract with the United Auto Workers. And the automobile industry was unionized. And all over the country, workers began occupying their factories. It was the sit-down strike wave of 1937. And the CIO, this new union that was led by communists, was rising all over the country. And there were hundreds of sit-down strikes all over the country. And President Roosevelt supported it. And in his radio broadcast, he said workers had the right to occupy their factories. And so because Roosevelt was facing the threat of being overthrown by a fascist coup, he needed all the support he can get. So he was backing the labor movement and backing the sit-down strike wave. And that was 1937. And it was William Z. Foster's labor leaders that he'd trained. They were the ones that were leading the sit-down strike wave and the rise of the CIO. Now, what's interesting is the leader of the Communist Party during that time was this guy, Earl Browder. And Earl Browder and Foster didn't like each other. Foster was a labor union organizer. He was more working class. He was from an Irish Catholic family in Philadelphia. Earl Browder, on the other hand, was an accountant, and he was quite wealthy. And Earl Browder was more about organizing the liberals and more organizing, writers and college professors and people like that. And Earl Browder and William Z. Foster did not like each other. Foster was running the labor wing of the party, and Browder was running the liberal, intellectual, popular, anti-fascist wing of the party. And the two didn't like each other. Publicly, they didn't acknowledge their differences, but they really didn't like each other. And Browder very much thought that Foster was kind of a threat to his power. And Browder was very excited about supporting Roosevelt. And Browder was constantly always trying to tone down the revolutionary message of the Communist Party and say that we're just part of the Roosevelt coalition. And that was Browder's message. And Foster was always trying to emphasize the class struggle militancy and the picket lines. And so there was a difference between the two of them. So fast forward, we know what eventually happened. The Second World War broke out. Right? And before the Second World War, we saw in the movie last night, there was the Stalin-Hitler Pact, where the Soviet Union, to buy time, because none of the Western countries would make a deal with them, they signed a deal with Hitler. And immediately after that happened, after they signed the Non-Aggression Pact, Roosevelt and his administration turned on the Communist Party. And Earl Browder, the leader of the Communist Party, was thrown in jail. Time magazine started calling the Communist Party the Communazis. And there was a whole public relations campaign against the Communist Party because they had been saying fascism was the main threat, and then they had signed a deal with Hitler. And everyone was ridiculing them and saying, oh, you're just a bunch of Russian agents. You don't really have any principles. Look, you're anti-fascist now you're signing a deal with Hitler. A lot of people quit the Communist Party over that, etc. But then we know what happened later. Hitler broke his deal. And then World War II, the United States got involved in World War II, Pearl Harbor. And Earl Browder was let out of prison, and the communists became the most enthusiastic supporters of World War II because they said Nazis were the main danger. They signed a no-strike pledge, and it was correct to support the United States in the fight against the Nazis, but Earl Browder, who was running the Communist Party, took it to ridiculous extremes. Number one, they complied with Japanese internment. They basically expelled all their Japanese members and told them to comply with being interned. Second, they dissolved. The Communist Party actually dissolved and became the Communist Political Association. And they stopped being a political party because they thought having a separate political party might divide the country. And then when Roosevelt and Stalin and Winston Churchill met in Iran, in Tehran, they signed an agreement called the Tehran Accords about what they were going to do after World War II. Earl Browder wrote a book called Tehran, Our Path in War and Peace, and said that after World War II, there would be no class struggle ever again. The workers and the bosses were united because they were anti-fascist on the basis of defending democratic values. And he argued that the United States and the Soviet Union were eventually going to merge into one country that would combine the best elements of both capitalism and socialism, and both the American system and the Soviet system, and they would become one country that would spread anti-fascism all over the world. And that was Earl Browder's policy. And William Z. Foster and all kinds of people in the Communist Party were horrified by this. They were basically just dissolving. And we know that what happened was that Earl Browder was being courted by the government. The State Department was frequently calling him to Washington, D.C. and giving him instructions and telling him what to say. There was at one point, Mao wrote a statement criticizing the U.S. government for not giving him enough weapons to fight Japan. So Earl Browder wrote about it, or I think he's talked about it on the radio. And then the State Department called him up and told him, well, don't say that. So he got on the radio and he apologized for saying that and said, well, I must have had bad information, and apologized for saying that. And Earl Browder had dissolved the Communist Party. It was the Communist Political Association, et cetera. But then we all know what happened is Roosevelt died, and the Second World War was coming to an end. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as World War II was ending, it was very clear that Winston Churchill and a number of leaders of the Western countries, Truman and others, were preparing to then make the Soviet Union the new target. And so they had an emergency convention of the Communist Party, and they said we have to reestablish the Communist Party, and we have to focus on fighting American imperialism. And Earl Browder did not accept that. He said that American imperialism was now progressive because it was anti-fascist, and that he refused to accept that new line. So they expelled Earl Browder from the party, and they had the anti-Browder campaign. And the Communist Party was reestablished in 1945 at an emergency convention. And Earl Browder was kicked out of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party apologized for a lot of what they had done during the Second World War, because they'd gone so over the top with their policies.
FDR committed class suicide in siding with the workers, but he never really gave them the whole full strength to do the revolution that should have happened.
Yeah, well, this is called Bonapartism, and it's when the capitalists fight with each other and they enlist workers to be their foot soldiers in various fights. And Roosevelt was a Bonapartist figure. His own class was against him, so in order to strengthen himself, he made an alliance. Yeah.
So the issue for me was, of course, that even Stalin was willing to basically dissolve the Comintern, the Communist International, as a way of building his alliance with FDR. But obviously, with FDR's, some people think that he was murdered. Stalin, I know we talked about the story. Stalin had made an attempt to have the ambassador view the body of FDR, and was denied by Eleanor Roosevelt, whether he was arsenic poisoning or not. But once his death took place, it was obviously the beginning of the Cold War, and reversals of policies that that relationship, that alliance between FDR and the Communist parties no longer existed.
Yeah.
And that's why they probably had that emergency meeting. And I don't know whether or not, if FDR had lived, and this is all speculation, whether or not there would have been divisions of Korea, would have been the difficulties in Southeast Asia, and the type of policies that are being enacted now. But that's all speculation.
Roosevelt favored friendship with the Soviet Union. That's clear.
Right.
And after his death, U.S. foreign policy dramatically shifted in the opposite direction. There's
That's
no
exactly
question about that. So, yeah.
I think FDR also supported like the decolonization of Asia and Africa. And that was obviously like when Truman became president, that was a reverse from that policy. Yeah, he was very like anti like empire.
Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. All right. So I guess we'll move on to our final segment of this class. All right. Oh, I'm got it. So the Communist Party was reconvened, but the Cold War is beginning. And also you have to remember that the USA suddenly has a booming economy, because the USA is the only country in the world that wasn't destroyed in the war, and because the workers in the industries have labor union benefits, and the whole world is buying its steel and its cars and its refrigerators and all that from the United States. So suddenly the United States has the strongest, economy, and the life of American industrial workers is, the best it's been. The post-World War II economic expansion is the greatest episode of economic growth in human history. Between the end of the Second World War and 1971, or some say 73, there was the biggest wave of development. And all over the world, you saw countries rising up from poverty, industrializing. The communist countries were industrializing. You had social democracy in Western Europe and the rise of the huge welfare states, guaranteed jobs, etc. You also had various military regimes that the United States was backing against communism that were industrializing and were raising people up. And in the United States, that's when we had Leave It to Beaver and etc. And of course, then in such an atmosphere, the Communist Party's message is not not going over pretty well because people have good jobs, they have good wages. What do they need a communist revolution for? And that labor aristocracy that we talk about was really expanding, right? People, the conditions of a lot of American white workers were good enough that it kind of bought their loyalty to empire. And the other thing at that time was that there was this new invention that everyone suddenly had called television. And television made Americans very terrified of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was going to drop atomic bombs on them and kill them. And they had kids doing little drills and hiding under their desks, and they were convinced the Soviet Union was going to bomb them. So there was a huge crackdown on the Communist Party after World War II. And many of the liberals who had joined on the basis of anti-fascism immediately apologized and denounced the Communist Party. And the FBI just moved in to crush the Communist Party. And in 1948, the entire national board of the Communist Party was put on trial. And this is them outside the courtroom in Foley Square in New York City. And they were charged with teaching an ideology that could necessitate the violent overthrow of the American government. And at their trial, they said that they had never advocated the overthrow of the American government. And they showed many, many places they had said, we don't advocate that. But the evidence against them was books by Karl Marx and books by Lenin that the prosecutors said that by distributing those books would lead people to think that they should overthrow the government. And so because of that, a number of Communist Party leaders went to federal prison for 8 years, for 10 years, for 5 years. And it was basically illegal to be in the Communist Party. Now, William Z. Foster, because he was so old at this point, he was in his 70s, and he had a heart condition. He was declared not fit to stand trial. So he didn't go on trial. But pretty much the entire national board of the Communist Party was sent to federal prison during these years. The Congress also passed a law called the McCarran Internal Security Act in 1951. And that law gave the U.S. Department of Justice the permission to put 2 million Americans in concentration camps if a national emergency was declared. So the U.S. Department of Justice made a list of 2 million people, and the idea was if there was a national emergency, those 2 million people could be rounded up and put in prison camps. The FEMA camps, you ever hear people talk about FEMA camps? They come from the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1951. That law is still on the books technically, and the camps are still there, but they've taken the part about putting people on a list out. That's the Supreme Court nullified that part. But yeah, that's where the FEMA camps come from. It's those Federal Emergency Management, right? That's FEMA, and the FEMA camps, that's the camps, and they were built to put communists in them. So someone should tell Alex Jones that those camps were built for communists. But what's amazing is the Communist Party was facing all of this heavy repression, right? And they were completely illegal. People were being prosecuted. You had the House Un-American Activities Committee that was calling people before the committee and demanding they name names and expose their coworkers, et cetera. They still did amazing work during this time period. Right? And this shows how much of a mass organization they were. So 1948, you have a presidential election, and Truman is the new president, and he's presiding over this huge crackdown on the Communist Party. So Henry Wallace, who was the vice president under Roosevelt, ran against Truman in the election, and he formed the Progressive Party. And the Communist Party were his staff. And even though their organization was completely illegal, they had a major campaign against the Democrats. And Henry Wallace, because the communists were running his campaign and because he was running against Truman, he started emphasizing racial equality and opposing Jim Crow segregation in his campaign. And Truman realized he might lose the black vote in the northern centers where black people could vote. So Truman integrated the armed forces, and he came out against Jim Crow segregation. Well, Truman was a Democrat, and the bulk of the Democratic Party was in the South. And so the Southern Democrats, they split with the Democratic Party. And the Democratic vote was split 3 ways in 1948. You had the far-left Democrats that were voting for Henry Wallace. You had regular Democrats voting for Truman. And you had the racist Democrats voting for Strom Thurmond and the National States Rights Party. And there's a famous picture of Harry Truman holding up a newspaper that says, "Dewey defeats Truman." And the reason he's holding that up is because there's no way he could have won that election, because the Democrats were split 3 ways and the Republicans were united. He should have lost. Dewey should have won. But there was vote rigging in almost every major center. He got like 100% of the vote in Chicago and 100% of the vote in other cities, and that's how he was able to win. It was a rigged election in 1948. The fact that the Communist Party was that powerful that they could impact a national election like that, even at a time when they were being crushed, is amazing. They formed something called the Civil Rights Congress. And actually the term civil rights, that comes from the Communist Party. That was the word that they decided to use as the word to fight racism. So they formed the Civil Rights Congress. And the Civil Rights Congress went around advocating for the rights of black people, the right to vote, the right to drink at the same drinking fountain as white people, etc. And then at the United Nations, the Soviet Union gave a platform to William L. Patterson, who was a member of the Communist Party and a leader of the Civil Rights Congress, to give a speech and present a document called We Charge Genocide, accusing the American government of genocide against black people. And at the Soviet Union, this African-American communist leader gave a speech condemning racism, and it was huge. And then the Communist Party printed thousands of copies of the speech and thousands of copies of the document and went to every black neighborhood in the country and sold copies of it. And thousands of black Americans got this document with facts about the conditions of black people in America, learning that the Soviet Union was on their side. I often refer to the fact, I grew up in a really small town. I tell this story a lot because it's really important, but I had a history teacher who was really into the history of my little town. And so he would go back into the microfilm archives of the newspaper in my little town called Orrville, Ohio. And he found a news article from 1951 in my town's local newspaper. And the headline was, "Take That, Uncle Joe." And what was the article about? It was about the first black family in my town had bought a house. And the article began with a quote from Stalin about America's a racist society that oppresses black people. And then the article went on to say, well, clearly Stalin doesn't know what he's talking about because this black family just moved in, they have a house, so clearly America's not a racist country. But that shows how impactful the Communist Party's work around the issue of civil rights really was. They were doing amazing work to oppose racism, and they were a completely illegal organization at that point, and they were operating in secret as a clandestine network of people, and a lot of their members were indicted and a lot of their members were in prison, but they were still doing all this amazing work. So what happened was that the FBI realized they couldn't just completely wipe them out, so they began infiltrating the organization. And they used the issue of race to destroy the Communist Party. And this is something that is really fascinating if you read the history of the Communist Party. They used the race question to take control of the Communist Party during the 1950s. And so Peter is going to read us a selection from, yeah, from the text about how they used the issue of race to take over the party.
Yeah, you gave me a nice long one here for my first one today. So FBI infiltration by Nelson Peary. Nelson Peary. I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is from Nelson Peary, who was a leader of the Communist Party at the time. This is from his autobiography.
Yeah. He's what do the kids say? Based. He's based. Red-pilled. Yeah. Now, Nelson Peary, an African-American communist organizer in Cleveland, Caleb's home state of Ohio, described how the FBI approached him, setting up a situation in which they hoped he would be willing to cooperate with them. Quote, "I started handing out leaflets. Those who took them seemed shocked and angered to see that a real-life communist would come to their shopping district and boldly pass out a leaflet. The backward glares as they hurried away were warning enough to get ready. A few moments later, 3 young toughs, perhaps in their late 20s, approached me. 'What you handing out?' one of them said to me. 'You can't pass that out. Give me the goddamn leaflets.' 'I've got a right to pass them out. If you don't like it, too bad.' The crowd had grown from 7 into a mob. They were cursing and shouting, urging one another to start the fight. 'Break it up. Stand back. FBI, break it up.' 2 men holding their gold badges and guns up in front of them parted the crowd. 'What the hell are you doing, Peary? You trying to start a riot?' Walking between them to the waiting car, I didn't answer. As we pulled away from the mob, one of the agents turned to me. 'My name is Fred Anderson. I just got transferred from the Chattanooga office. You're damned lucky we came by.' 'Well, I never thought I'd be glad to see the FBI. Thanks.' Something didn't jive. These guys just happened to come along and now they were talking to me like I was their long-lost buddy. I'd like to ask you a question. Why are you wasting your life? These people you are associated with aren't serious. I'm serious, and I think I'd be wasting my life if I went along with all this. You've got to admit things are getting better. I have a feeling they're going to get a lot better. You can contribute to that." Suddenly it was clear the whole thing was a setup. They set up a situation where I'd be dependent on them, willing to listen to them, maybe become a cog in their network inside the party. Quote, "I think I'm contributing to it. Look, I really thank you gentlemen for what you've done. I don't want to appear ungrateful. but I don't want to talk to you about the party. And then they told him, okay, it's your life, but when you find out we were telling the truth, come talk to us. No one will know. So that's what they said. They pulled over at 9th and Euclid. I thanked them as politely as I could and got out of the car. The Rosenbergs were executed that night, despite worldwide protests. And starting around 1952, the FBI switched its tactics to disrupting the party from within, rather than simply trying to crush it with prosecutions. In order to more or less destroy the party, the FBI seized on the issue of race. The Communist Party's national office announced an internal campaign against, quote, white chauvinism. The FBI arranged for a large number of members to be expelled for alleged racism. Nelson Peary explained this sinister tactic. Quote, the strongest rampart of the party was its historic work with and for African American liberation. The FBI understood that this was also their least defensible point. It was a point of penetration into the party, and some of the most destructive work was done through black informers. The party's desperate struggle against white chauvinism, which in later years was termed racism, created the political atmosphere for white agents to protect and advance the black informers. The FBI approached many militant African Americans and almost all the black comrades with the carrot and the stick. They were offered money as well as job security if they would become informers. At the same time, they were threatened with or faced exposure and blacklisting if they did not cooperate. The vast majority refused. A few became informers. Most informers were simply opportunists or political degenerates. We seldom talked about it, but we knew the struggle against white chauvinism had blinded many white comrades to angry danger coming from this direction. The FBI converted it into one of its principal weapons. Accusing a white comrade of white chauvinism or getting some black informer to do so was akin to a political lynching. Even those who understood what was going on dared not stand with the accused for fear of becoming part of the crime. The flip side of the coin was always there. Any serious charge of white chauvinism on the part of an African American comrade inevitably ended up in a debate over black nationalism. For honest party members, the struggle against white chauvinism became a lose-lose situation. American novelist Howard Fast described the atmosphere in the party that was created by the FBI. I had written a piece about a meeting I had addressed in Boston. In it, I described a, quote, mixed group of boys and girls, white and Negro. The piece was for the Daily Worker. I dropped it off, but it was not printed that day nor the following day. And the day after, I was called downtown to face 3 of the editors to undergo a process called charges, quote unquote. I was being brought up on charges of white chauvinism. Why? Well, that was something I wanted to know. I had no recollection of writing or doing anything that smacked of white chauvinism. They hastened to enlighten me. Any reference to Negro boys or girls as boys or girls was chauvinist. The incredible reasoning, if you can call it that, behind this was that for generations of servitude, black slaves had been addressed as boy or girl. What are they? Youths. I dislike the word as a noun. Boys, girls, teenagers, kids, adolescents, high school kids, youngster. There were, let me turn this page, anticipation here. There were enough words to describe them between puberty and adulthood. Why youths? Bullshit, I told them, that it was absolute bullshit, and that it made no sense, it would never become a common word as a noun. I was slipping in deeper and deeper, and I was told that this blank spot in my thinking demonstrated how poorly I understood white chauvinism. And if I could not accept the decision of the party on this usage, they would bring me up on charges for expulsion from the party. I protested that they were kidding, they had to be kidding. To expel me from the party for a silly disagreement about the usage of a word? Not the word, but the failure to understand the depths of white chauvinism. In retrospect, I ask myself why I didn't say, expel me, to hell with it, but retrospect has no validity. This was the party of Bill Foster and Big Bill Haywood and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the party that had organized the French resistance and fought the Nazis to the death, and taught the world a new lesson in courage and honor, the party that had created the Abraham Lincoln Brigades and never stinted at the price of freedom. No, damn it, let them be as loony as they wished about words. They were not going to expel me, so I agreed that I would work on this problem and see the error of my ways. Peary described how the FBI informants in the Communist Party's leadership often moved in to squash local organizers who seemed to be making a difference. He described how in 1953, the Communist Party formed the National Negro Labor Council, NNLC, and organized a boycott of Sears Roebuck because it refused to hire black employees. He recalled, quote, the NNLC flooded the ghetto with leaflets explaining the coming demonstration and calling for the neighborhood to come out en masse to demand their rights. The Cleveland Police and its Red Squad, notorious for their hatred of the black population, prepared to contain, if not prevent, the demonstration. However, the black community was not intimidated and assembled in big numbers in front of the department store. Quote, there were more than 3,000 people in front of the Sears building already. They stood bunched together, talking and sensing their strength. The west side of Carnegie Avenue was bumper to bumper with police cars. The cops stood in squads, fondling their clubs, occasionally sliding a gloved hand to touch the butt of a pistol. Peary describes how in response to the success in organizing against Sears, the Communist Party leadership demanded that they withdraw from the NNLC. Quote, every party member was aware something was going down in New York. The party seemed to be without direction the past several months. We didn't dare mention it, but we understood very well that it was this paralysis of the CP headquarters in New York that gave us the freedom to break out into the black workers of Cleveland. We twisted our way through the crowd and into the parking lot where the comrades were waiting. Bert picked up where he left off. Quote, I'm not sure what's going on, but it's serious. I just received a special delivery letter from New York. There has been a Central Committee decision that party forces are to pull out of the Labor Council. People I trust in New York tell me that some sort of deal has been struck with the government around bringing the second string of leadership to trial. It seems that a representative of the Department of Justice met with a representative from the party, and they worked out a deal on further indictments. It looks like the government has already gotten what it was after. Now, in return, the party must withdraw from the National Negro Labor Council and liquidate the party in the South and Puerto Rico. That's that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was pretty clear. Yeah. It was pretty clear in the 1950s that the FBI was kind of taking control of the Communist Party. Now, the main person who was an FBI go ahead.
I'm sorry. That's when around the time McCarthyism started.
Yeah, McCarthyism first crushed, the party, and then they couldn't completely crush it, so the FBI went in. The main informant, the head of the FBI network of informants inside the Communist Party was a guy named Morris Childs. And Morris Childs he had been a leader of the Communist Party, and he had been perceived as being a friend of Earl Browder, and so he had been fired from his job at the Daily Worker, and so he was bitter about it, and he quit the Communist Party. And then his brother got cancer, and the FBI approached him and offered to pay for his brother's cancer treatments in exchange for him going back into the Communist Party to be an FBI informant. So he went back into the Communist Party as the FBI informant, and he became the chief informant inside the Communist Party, and he was on the national committee of the Communist Party until the 1980s. And he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan for his job controlling the Communist Party for the FBI. He went to Moscow every year, and he took a suitcase with $2 million in cash, back from Moscow under the direction of the FBI, and that money was used to buy the headquarters of the Communist Party, to pay members that were activists, etc.
So that's how they got that headquarters?
Yes, that is. And there's a whole book about this called Operation Solo. It's all declassified now, but Morris Childs was a National Committee member of the Communist Party for years, and he was controlling the Communist Party for the FBI. Now, 1956 is the year that Stalin had died, and Khrushchev came to power in the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev, in the 1956 Party Congress, he went on a tirade against Stalin. And he said that he accused Stalin of all kinds of things that were not true. He said that Stalin had been, so scared when the Nazis invaded, the Soviet Union that he started crying and hid under his desk. He was so terrified. And he accused Stalin of all kinds of things. And that speech was leaked, and it came to the United States, and many communists felt completely betrayed because they'd been saying that what the U.S. government was saying about Stalin and the Soviet Union wasn't true, and now the leader of the Soviet Union himself was saying that it was true. And around that time, suddenly the Communist Party stopped getting harassed by the FBI as much, and they started having public events again, which they hadn't been able to do for quite some time. And so after the secret speech, Eugene Dennis, a leader of the Communist Party, he's the guy in the middle here, he came out and he published a document called Communists Take a New Look. And he announced that the Communist Party was going to have its first convention the following year, and they were going to decide whether or not they would dissolve or they would drop communism as their ideology and just become a socialist party, where they would cut ties to the Soviet Union or what. And the Communist Party had a bunch of public meetings and basically apologized for supporting Stalin, and they started attacking William Z. Foster because William Z. Foster had been the leader of the Communist Party during all the years when Stalin was rising, etc. And they started accusing, and Foster saw that the anti-Stalin campaign was also aimed at him. So in 1957, the Communist Party had its first national convention that they'd had for quite some time. And at that convention, the Communist Party was divided into three factions. The first faction was led by a guy named John Gates. And John Gates wanted them to completely cut all ties to the Soviet Union and merge with the Socialist Party. And the second faction was led by Eugene Dennis and Gus Hall. And Gus Hall ended up being the face of communism for the following years. And they wanted to maintain the Communist Party, but they embraced Khrushchev, and they also wanted to oppose black nationalism. They felt black nationalism was not good, and they wanted to maintain ties to the Soviet Union, but they supported the de-Stalinization efforts. And Foster's faction was the third faction, and Foster did not embrace de-Stalinization, and Foster's faction also continued supporting the Black Belt and black nationalism. And so at the convention, the John Gates faction and the Gus Hall faction teamed up and defeated the Foster faction. And the Soviet Union, or the Communist Party, embraced de-Stalinization and Khrushchev. And then the John Gates faction ended up leaving because the John Gates faction didn't get their way, and they had continued publishing anti-Soviet articles in the Daily Worker. So the John Gates faction was out. And from about 1956 until today, the Communist Party has never been more than 2,000 people. At this point, I think it's a couple hundred at the most. But it's always been quite small since then. And that 1956 fight was kind of the last hurrah. Most of Foster's supporters were kicked out of the party or expelled. But Foster, if they'd kicked him out, that would have been a huge public relations dilemma. So what they did is they basically forced him into early retirement. He became chairman emeritus, and he was in early retirement. And he was very, very old. And so as he was getting older, he started to realize that Mao was disagreeing with Khrushchev. And so he wrote a letter to Mao without asking the permission of the Communist Party. And he sent a long letter to Mao that was basically defending himself and defending his achievements as the leader of the Communist Party. And somehow the New York Times got their hands on it, probably from the FBI or something. And the New York Times published this letter that he had written to Mao, and they published it in the New York Times. And the Communist Party was very embarrassed by the fact that their chairman had written this letter to Mao. And so the Communist Party then had to publish it reluctantly. And in that letter, Foster was basically subtly criticizing Khrushchev and saying, I like Mao because Mao is disagreeing with Khrushchev. Foster, his heart was deteriorating. He was 80 years old. And so he wanted to go get medical care in the Soviet Union. But he was still under indictment by the US Department of Justice for being a communist. So they had to have a legal battle, and finally the courts gave in, and they allowed him to go to the Soviet Union. And so in the Soviet Union, for his 80th birthday, he was in a hospital bed. And you can look, this is a picture that I just had to include because the story behind it is so important, right? So in the Soviet Union, it's on page 57, in the Soviet Union, for his 80th birthday, Khrushchev came to visit William Z. Foster in the hospital for a photo op. And it was just a photo op. There's Khrushchev and there's William Z. Foster, 80 years old, in his wheelchair there, being greeted by Khrushchev. And what happened at that meeting is very important. So Foster's 80 years old. He's just a couple months away from his death. And from the hospital wheelchair, or from his hospital bed, he gave a speech honoring Mao, who Khrushchev had just denounced. Khrushchev had denounced Mao and cut ties to China. So from his hospital bed, Foster gave a speech honoring Mao Zedong to Khrushchev, and everyone in the room went silent, and it was super awkward. And he died several months later. And yeah, that's our first class.
You know, the end of atmospheric testing of nuclear bombs, amongst other things. I forgot off the top of my head, but that was one of the things. And they were in the process of ending the Cold War until he was assassinated. And of course, that's the role of the deep state that was very much against ending the Cold War. That's very much powering a lot of our policies today. And I just wanted to come off of anyone who saw Oppenheimer, the movie, and we saw that process taking place when Oppenheimer was being targeted by Louis Strauss, I forget the character, Downey Jr.'s character, how he basically tried to control him and prevent Oppenheimer from pursuing a policy of nuclear limitations, nuclear bombing limitations. And that's part of beginning of the Cold War and repressing progressive forces in the United States, including the Communist Party.
What else? What other reactions did people have? Any other thoughts, comments?
Sadness.
Oh, please, yeah.
I knew a lot of the people who stayed in from the 30s.
Yeah, there you go.
I was blessed through my ex-wife to have met Ben and Mark Alper, and they had served in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. These people, some of them were heroic people. Some of them had done time in prison. Yeah, it got infiltrated and it got all screwed up. But I tell you, I met some of the best people I have ever met through the Communist Party. People who had sacrificed, people who really did some hard work and didn't stop. And in Boston, you know, we had a city councilor for years. He was a member of the Green Rainbow Party, and then later we got a Puerto Rican nationalist liberation theology guy. We stayed relevant in Boston. I know Comrade stayed relevant in New York and Cleveland through Dennis Kucinich. Like, yeah, it sucked. It was bad, but they were really some good, honest, heroic people.
No, I mean, when you say that, I'm tearing up a little bit too, because I remember when the first time I ever visited New York City. I was a senior in high school. And I took the bus with my friend from Ohio, and we went to a big anti-war protest in 2006 in New York City. And on every corner, there'd be an old person, like in their 70s or 80s, who would be trying to sell you a newspaper or something, and it was, you know, it was the capitalists and the workers that were struggling against the capitalists, you know, and they were the nicest, and they weren't all in the Communist Party at that point. A lot of them were in other groups, you know, and they had this approach where it was, you know, it was the workers and the bosses, and racism is the boss's tool to divide the workers. Yeah, you know, and they had this approach that was about economics, it was about social justice, it was about opposing war and opposing racism. And I'll never forget, you know, that on that day, you know, I was marching down the street, you know, as part of this anti-war rally. We walked by a group of old men in wheelchairs. It said Veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade against the war in Iraq. You know, and it was like there were only 5 or 6 of them still alive. But those are guys that had volunteered to fight Franco in Spain before World War II. They were Abraham Lincoln Brigade volunteers. And that, you know, the Communist Party, it had a huge impact, right? It was it wasn't as big in this country as it was in many other countries, but the fact that, I mean, even then, this was 2006. I mean, this was long after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was just, it left a crater. You think about like a meteorite hits the earth and there's a huge crater around it. Like the impact that the Communist Party had is massive. I mean, Social Security, unemployment insurance, these things, we wouldn't have that if it wasn't for the Communist Party. You know, the Civil Rights Movement, I talked about that. I mean, the Communist Party, like the impact that the Communist Party had on America is just utterly massive. And there was a layer of people who maybe they weren't in it, but they had grown up around it and they had learned from it and they had a certain approach. And And I think about even like some of the older folks that I knew that were in the Workers' World Party that had grown up in the Communist Party and the way they approached things. There was something about, and it was Foster. I mean, it was William Z. Foster. I mean, it was that, the language that they used, they would use working class as an adjective. If something was good, they'd say, that's a real working class approach you've got there. That's a real working class way of putting things, you know? They had a way of framing things. I remember Frances used to say, you know, this older woman that was in the Workers' World Party with me, she was in her 80s, she used to say, they say this country's a democracy, but you don't get to elect your boss. You don't get to vote for your boss. How can this be a democracy? You know, they had this way of talking and approaching things that was just very, very unique, and it comes from that period.
Was to protest all war.
Yeah. Well, this was largely, I mean, it was a very big rally that the Democrats had organized.
Oh.
What I remember also, I'll just throw this out there, was that at that particular march, there were a whole bunch of people that were being handed signs by MoveOn.org. And the sign said, out of Iraq into Darfur. And they were calling for the USA to invade Sudan. I thought that was classic. And they were handing out just, oh, have a sign, out of Iraq into Darfur. It was awful. Yeah, and that was Soros, though. So there you go. Yeah.
Just one last comment, and the pizza's going to go. But you know, it's clear that we're seeing a form of early forms of cancel culture that denied the role of the Soviet Union that defeated fascism. That's part of the myth they created. The fact that they bore the brunt of the fighting during World War II. Mm-hmm. So people don't know this, but that's part of the process.
And also the stuff that Peter read about the FBI, how they saw that anti-racism was such an important part of what the Communist Party had. They tried to turn their strength into a weakness, right? And they used this FBI-fomented campaign against white chauvinism to break apart the party. And that is very, very sinister. And Nelson Peary's writing on that is very, very powerful. And you think of like Howard Fast, that part about how they tried to expel him for using the word boys and girls because they said it was racist, right? And how he sat there and he's like, well, I guess this is the Communist Party, right? I guess they have a right to be loony if they want to be loony, you know? And a lot of people went along with that. And that if you've been in any of the like existing communist organizations, stuff like that goes on all the time, right? He was describing how the Communist Party, I guess you said, they lost a $2 million building accidentally in Los Angeles. He was just telling me, I'd never heard that. But it's like things like that go all the time. The FBI is all over these organizations and is manipulating them from within. And people that start actually organizing things get kicked out. And certain people that seem very, very incompetent always end up being in charge. And there's a lot of, manipulation. And then all of these groups that have been around for decades, they've all been very heavily infiltrated and controlled by the government. And what's weird is they're now being used largely to help Joe Biden against Trump. They're being used to do the woke thing, largely, which is interesting. And that, for a lot of them, that's the point of no compromise. We support Biden against Trump. Trump is the main danger. They will not budge on that, even though Trump is more anti-war than the Democrats are, right? But for some reason, these groups know we must support the Democrats. It's like a point that just can't be opposed. And some of them to the point that they'll say they don't support the Democrats, but they still think the Republicans or Trump are the main threat and that everything must be done to stop Trump, and that shows how controlled these groups really are through funding, through actual agents that go into them, et cetera.